Gerald Foss grabbed Clara's wrist right there in the middle of the dining room, in front of every guest seated at his table, and twisted until she dropped the serving tray. Crash of china against hardwood silenced the room. He leaned close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, and he said it loud enough for everyone to hear. A woman like you ought to be grateful anyone lets her through the door. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. 12 people sat at that table and watched, and not one of them put down their fork. That was the moment Clara Whitmore understood something she'd been too stubborn to admit for 32 years, that the world would only give her what she was willing to fight for. Nothing more. Nothing less. If you've ever been dismissed before anyone even learned your name, this story is for you. Stay until the end, and if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Train pulled into Willow Creek on a Tuesday morning in late October, and Clara Whitmore was the last one off. She stood on the platform with a leather suitcase held together by a strip of rope she'd added herself after the clasp broke somewhere in Nebraska, in a canvas bag hanging from her other shoulder that held, among other things, a recipe notebook with a cracked spine and pages stained with years of kitchens. She wore a dark blue dress that had been washed so many times the fabric had gone soft in a way that was just past presentable, and her hair was pinned up neatly, the way she always kept it when she was walking into something uncertain, which was most of her life. Willow Creek was not an impressive town. It had the bones of something that wanted to be more than it was. A main street with a general store, a feed shop, a telegraph office, a saloon with a hand-painted sign missing its second L, and a row of buildings that leaned slightly westward as if they'd been watching the wind for too long and finally gave in to it. Mountains sat in the distance like something that didn't care whether the town survived or not. Clara studied all of it from the platform before she moved. She had learned a long time ago that the first 30 seconds in a new place told you nearly everything you needed to know. The way people looked at a stranger, whether they looked at all, said more about a town than any advertisement in a newspaper. 2 women standing near the general store looked over when she stepped off the train. She could see the assessment happen in real time. The way their eyes moved from her face to her clothes to her bag and back again, the small adjustment in their posture that meant they had already made a decision. Neither of them smiled. One said something to the other behind her hand. Clara had seen that before, too. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the street. The advertisement she'd answered was tucked into the front pocket of her canvas bag, folded into quarters, and read so many times the creases were going soft. She had it memorized by now, though she kept the paper anyway. Experienced cook sought for cattle ranch household. Must manage meals for working crew and family. Employer is widower with 2 children. Serious inquiries only. Contact W. Carter, Willow Creek, Wyoming. She had written back in her careful handwriting, listed her experience honestly without embellishment, and received a single reply. Come Tuesday on the 10 o'clock train. I'll have someone meet you. There was no one waiting on the platform. She'd checked twice. The man at the telegraph office pointed her toward the livery stable when she asked, telling her that Marcus Webb, one of Carter's ranch hands, sometimes picked up supplies there on Tuesdays. He said it the way people said things in small towns, like they were doing you a favor by talking to you at all, and you should remember that. She found Marcus Webb leaning against a wagon outside the stable, whittling something small from a piece of pine. He was a weathered man, somewhere around 50, with a face that had spent 3 decades in Wyoming wind and showed every year of it. He looked at her the same way the women by the general store had, though he was a little less careful about hiding it. You the cook, he said. Clara Whitmore, she said. Yes. He looked at her for another moment, then folded his knife and tucked it in his pocket. Wagons here. We're a 40-minute ride. That was the whole conversation. She loaded her suitcase without being asked, which she appreciated, and they drove out of Willow Creek without another word. Clara sat on the wagon bench and watched the town disappear behind them and the land open up ahead, wide and dry and swept clean by a wind that had no patience for anything soft. She had been in 14 different towns in the past 8 years. She knew how to read them quickly. Willow Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, which meant it was also the kind of place where stories traveled fast and stuck hard. She would have to be careful. She would have to be exactly what the advertisement asked for, and nothing more, nothing less, until she understood the landscape. It was what she told herself on the wagon ride. Be careful. Be steady. Don't want too much too soon. She had not followed that advice before. She was going to try harder this time. Carter Ranch appeared at the end of a long dirt road lined with cottonwood trees that had gone yellow in the autumn cold. Main house was 2 stories, built from timber and stone in the way of someone who'd planned to be there for a long time. Barn, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings. The whole property had an air of something that had once been well tended and was now simply being maintained, the difference between a place that was loved and a place that was endured. Marcus pulled the wagon to a stop near the front porch and climbed down without ceremony, carried her suitcase to the front steps and set it there. "Mr. Carter's inside," he said, and went back toward the barn. Clara stood at the bottom of the porch steps and took a breath. Wind came off the mountains cold and sharp, and she could smell wood smoke from the chimney. Someone inside the house was burning a fire, which meant someone inside the house was awake and functioning, and she decided to take that as a reasonable sign. She knocked on the door. It took a while, long enough that she wondered if she was supposed to go around back. Some households had those arrangements, where the help came and went through a separate entrance. She was deciding whether to try when the door opened. William Carter was not what she expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. Tall, lean in the way of men who worked physically and forgot to eat enough, with dark hair that needed cutting, and the kind of tired that lived in a person's eyes rather than just on their face. Somewhere in his late 30s, she guessed. He wore a work shirt and suspenders and looked like he had dressed this morning only because it would have been stranger not to. Looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not the quick assessment of the women in town, not Marcus Webb's flat appraisal. Something more complicated. Like a man trying to remember what the correct response to a situation was and finding that the knowledge had gone slightly rusty. "Miss Whitmore," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "Mr. Carter," she said. "I appreciate you having me." Stepped back and let her in. The front hall was clean but cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. There was a coat rack with 3 coats on it, a pair of small boots near the door that belonged to a child, a table with a lamp that wasn't lit in the middle of the day. The house was quiet in the particular way that houses got quiet when people inside them had stopped trying to fill the silence. "Shh, I'll show you the kitchen," William said, and walked ahead without waiting to see if she followed. Kitchen was larger than she anticipated, with a wood range along one wall, the long preparation table down the center, shelves of supplies, cold pantry through a side door. It had been a serious kitchen once. She could see that. Someone had put thought into the arrangement, put real care into stocking it. Care had lapsed. There were supplies that were running low and hadn't been replaced, a pot on the back of the stove with something dried to the bottom that should have been cleaned a week ago, a smell of burned coffee that had soaked into the air. She did not say anything about any of that. "I feed 12 ranch hands at breakfast and dinner," William said, standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms folded. Not defensive, just like he didn't quite know what to do with himself. "My children eat with me. Ethan is 9, Lily is 7. Previous arrangement was he stopped. The last cook left 3 weeks ago. I've been managing. It hasn't been going particularly well. I can start today," Clara said, "if you'd like." He looked at her again with that unreadable expression. "Just like that? Just like that. I've been managing train stations and strange kitchens for longer than I care to count. Yours doesn't look worse than some I've known." Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but some small relaxation around the eyes, some slight lowering of whatever posture he'd been holding. "The room is upstairs, second door on the right. The children are in school until 3. I'll be out in the south field if you need anything. I'll have dinner ready at 6, she said. He nodded once and left through the back door without another word. Clara stood in the kitchen alone for a moment, looking at the cold range and the dried pot and the low shelves. And she took off her coat, hung it on the hook by the kitchen door, rolled up her sleeves. To work. The first thing she did was deal with that pot. It took 20 minutes and a good deal of elbow effort, but she scoured it clean and set it back in its place. She took full inventory of the pantry, writing notes in the margin of her recipe notebook about what was needed. She stoked the range and got it burning properly, checked the flue, found a rhythm in the kitchen that she always found eventually. Every kitchen had one. Its own particular tempo once you'd been in it long enough. She was making cornbread when she heard the small sound from the hallway. She turned slowly, the way you turned when you didn't want to startle something, and there was a girl standing at the edge of the kitchen. 7 years old, small for her age, with her father's dark hair and dark eyes, and a solemn expression that was too serious for a child's face. She was still in her school coat, which meant she'd come in through the front and gone straight to the kitchen, which meant she'd done it quietly on purpose. "Must be Lily," Clara said. The girl didn't answer. She stood very still and looked at Clara the way children looked at things when they were deciding whether to trust them. "You like cornbread?" Clara asked, turning back to her bowl. Pause. Then sometimes, "What makes you like it sometimes and not other times?" Another pause, longer this time. Clara could feel the girl thinking about whether this was a trap of some kind. "When it has too much sweet, I don't like it, Mrs. Henderson made it too sweet." Mrs. Henderson was the cook before? Before her was Mrs. Talbot. Before her was Ruby. But Ruby didn't last very long. She said it plainly, like she was reciting facts. They all left. Clara stirred her batter. "I don't make it sweet. Salt and butter. That's what cornbread should taste like." The sound of boots on the back porch came before she could say anything else. A boy appeared in the kitchen door, taller than his sister, broader through the shoulders, already wearing the expression of someone determined not to need anything from anyone. 9 years old and already practicing at being closed off. Hurt to look at a little. "Ethan," Clara said, before he could decide whether to acknowledge her or not. "There's water heating on the stove if you want to wash up before I start on dinner." He looked at her with the particular combination of suspicion and assessment that she recognized as his father's expression on a younger face. "You the new cook, Clara Whitmore," she said. "Yes." "How long are you staying?" The directness of it landed clean. A 9-year-old asking the question every person in that house was really asking, and the only one honest enough to say it out loud. "I intend to stay," she said, "as long as your father will have me, and as long as I'm doing a good job." "Others all said that," he told her, and went upstairs. Lily watched him go, then looked at Clara again. Clara noticed she was still wearing her coat, still deciding. "The water's almost warm," Clara said, not making a thing of it, "if you want to wash up too." Lily took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door. She moved to the basin without being asked again. Clara turned back to her batter and let the girl be. Gave her the space to make the decision herself, which was all any of them needed. Really just enough space to decide on their own terms. Dinner was beef and root vegetables, cornbread, and a soup she made from the bones she found at the back of the cold pantry that someone had saved and then apparently forgotten. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't meant to be. It was exactly what a cold October evening in Wyoming called for, something warm and solid and honest. She served the ranch hands first in the bunkhouse dining area, 12 men who came in dirty and tired and ate with the single-minded focus of people who worked very hard and were very hungry. A few nodded at her. Most didn't. That was fine. She didn't need to be liked on the first day, she just needed to be competent. Back in the main house, she set the table in the family dining room. 3 places she hadn't been told whether she ate with the family or separately, so she set for 3 and waited. William came in from outside, washed up, sat at the head of the table. Children came down. Nobody spoke. They passed the food around and served themselves and ate in a silence that was so thick and habitual that Clara understood in an instant why 3 cooks had left. Silence wasn't hostile. That would have been easier to manage. Simply grief that had settled into routine. Sorrow that had stopped requiring acknowledgement and just become the air they breathed. She ate in the kitchen. She had made that decision when she saw the table. This wasn't the right moment to push. When she came to clear the dishes, William was still at the table, his plate empty, a glass of water in his hand that he wasn't drinking. Children had gone upstairs. "It was good," he said, without turning around. "Thank you," she said. Lily ate 2 servings. She mentioned she doesn't like it when the cornbread is too sweet. Turned then, just slightly, enough to look at her from the side. "She told you that?" "First thing," Clara said, stacking the plates. He turned back to his water glass. "She hasn't talked much since—" He didn't finish the sentence. "She hasn't talked much." Clara carried the plates to the kitchen and didn't say anything in response, because there wasn't anything useful to say. Some things were too large for a response, and being quiet about them was the only real kindness. She washed the dishes, banked the fire in the kitchen range, checked that everything was set for the morning. The house settled around her in the way houses did at night, the sounds of it becoming familiar, which floorboard creaked, which window rattled in the wind, where the warmth pooled and where the drafts came through. She went upstairs to the second door on the right and found a small room with a single bed, a washstand, a window that looked out toward the barn. Someone had put a quilt on the bed, neatly folded. She didn't know if it had been there before or if someone had put it there today, but she put her hand on it in the dark and thought, this will do. Will do for now. She sat on the edge of the bed and took out her recipe notebook. She turned to a clean page near the back and wrote, in her careful hand, Lily, no sweetened cornbread. Ethan, watching to see if I'll leave. William Carter, grief like a second person in the room. She closed the notebook, lay back on the bed fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling and listened to the Wyoming windwork at the windows. She had been dismissed in 14 towns. She had started over more times than she could count without feeling sick. She had walked into places where people had already decided about her before she said a word, and she had kept walking anyway. Question was whether this time she could do something more than just survive it. She did not have an answer yet. She had made the cornbread right. Lily had eaten 2 servings. Sometimes that was how things started, not with some grand declaration or a perfect moment, but with something small that turned out to matter more than you expected. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow would come whether she was ready or not. It always did. 3 weeks passed before anyone in town said the first unkind thing to her face. It felt it before, that the looks when she came to the general store for supplies, the way conversations adjusted when she entered a room, but Margaret Elroy was the first to actually say something. Margaret was a broad-shouldered woman who ran the women's sewing circle and had opinions about everything, delivered with the particular confidence of someone who had never once been seriously wrong in her own estimation. She said it in the general store, loud enough that the 2 other women nearby could hear, heard William Carter's got a new woman in his house. Young one too, alone with him and those children. Clara was reading labels on a shelf of spice tins. She did not turn around. Must be something special, Margaret continued, about a woman willing to live out there all alone with a man she barely knows. Clara took the spice tin she'd been looking for and placed it in her basket and turned to carry it to the counter. She looked at Margaret Elroy directly as she walked past. Not in challenge, not in apology, just clearly. Good morning, she said as she passed. Margaret had not expected to be looked at directly. Confidence flickered for just a moment, not enough that anyone would have noticed if they weren't watching for it, but Clara noticed. She paid for her supplies and left. She was on the wagon back to the ranch before her hands stopped feeling tight around the basket handle. She had grown up in a town not unlike Willow Creek in Kentucky, in a house where being neat and quiet and useful were the measures of a woman's worth. She had been those things, and they had not protected her from anything. 20, she had taken a job as a kitchen assistant in Louisville, thinking distance and work would remake her, and that had led to other kitchens, the other towns, the long chain of years that eventually brought her here. She had gathered skills along the way, how to make a chicken stretch 3 meals, how to manage a difficult employer, how to be invisible when invisible was safer, how to be present when presence was necessary. What she had not learned, despite everything, was how to let people's worst assumptions roll off her like weather. She had not made peace with the way being looked at a certain way still landed somewhere in her chest and sat there. She was working on it. Ethan came into the kitchen on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks in and stood in the doorway without speaking, which was his particular way of starting conversations, standing near the thing he wanted to talk about and waiting to see what happened. Clara was making pastry dough, working the fat into the flour with her hands, which she found was still the best method despite what some cooks said about knives or pastry cutters. "What is it?" she said, without stopping. He came in and sat at the end of the preparation table and watched her work. Taken off his coat, he was wearing a flannel shirt that was a size too large, probably handed down from someone. Guy broke the fence post on the east side. "Did you tell your father?" Pause. "Not yet." Clara kept working the dough. "Was it an accident?" "I was using it to vault over. I've done it before. Post just cracked this time." "How long ago?" "This morning." She turned the dough out onto the table and pressed it flat with the heel of her hand. Her father was out that direction this afternoon. The longer pause. "I know, so he either already found it or he will." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Do you think he'll be real angry?" She thought about that honestly, because she thought he deserved an honest answer more than a comfortable one. William Carter was not a shouting man. She'd established that in the first week. He was a man who went cold and controlled when he was frustrated, which was in some ways harder to be on the receiving end of than shouting. "I think he'll be disappointed," she said, "and I think you already know that." "Yeah," Ethan said to the table. She shaped the dough into a round and set it to rest. The thing about getting ahead of it is it gives you some control over the story. If he finds it first, you're already at a disadvantage. He looked at her, then the first time he'd looked at her directly since the first day. He had his mother's chin, she suspected, and his father's eyes, and some combination of the two that made his face do something complicated when he was thinking hard. How do you know things like that? Practice, she said. Mostly the bad kind. He was quiet again. Then he pushed back from the table and stood up. I'm going to go tell him. All right, she said. He left through the back door. She listened to his boots on the porch and then on the dirt outside, going in the direction of the south barn where William had been working. She turned back to her pastry and let out a slow breath. She didn't know if it was her place to have said any of that. She was the cook. She was here to manage the kitchen and keep the household fed, not to weigh in on what the children should do about broken fence posts or anything else. She knew that. But Ethan had come to the kitchen and stood in the doorway in the way that meant he needed someone to talk to, and there hadn't been anyone else there. So she'd talked, and she'd meant what she said, and she hadn't prettied it up, which she thought was more respectful than softening it into something useless. She heard William's voice from somewhere outside, not the words, just the tone. Calm, the cold control kind, not the shouting kind. Then Ethan's voice. Quieter. Then silence. She rolled out the pastry and pressed it into the pan and didn't listen any harder than she could help. First frost came that week, and with it the first true sign that the ranch's season was shifting. Days got shorter in a way that felt sudden. The light gone before dinner was finished, the cold following you from outside in through your coat. Hands spent longer around the bunkhouse fire after meals, and the workday started in the dark. Clara adapted her cooking to the season. Heavier breakfasts, things that would carry through a cold morning. Soups that could stay warm on the back of the stove and be returned to throughout the day. She kept a pot of coffee going from before dawn until after dark, which the ranch hands appreciated more than they said. William noticed. He didn't say much about it, but he noticed. She could tell, because he had a way of looking at things that had been changed, looking at them carefully, taking it in without necessarily commenting. Coffee pot, the extra blanket she'd hung to warm near the kitchen fire in the evenings. Gah, the lamp she'd moved to the desk in the front hallway where she'd noticed he sometimes worked in the evenings so he wouldn't have to carry one from across the house. None of these things were large. She knew they weren't large. But small things done consistently were what she knew how to do, or the vocabulary she had. One evening, she came to clear the family dinner table and found William alone again, which was usual, but he had a piece of paper in front of him that he wasn't reading, just looking at. Way you looked at something you'd already decided about, but were still sitting with. Miss Whitmore, he said before she'd picked up the first dish. Carter. Ethan said you talked to him the other day. About telling me about the fence post. She set down the dish she'd picked up. I hope that was all right. He came in and seemed to need to talk through it. I didn't mean to overstep. He was quiet for a moment in a way that made her wonder if she'd miscalculated. Apologize to me, William said finally. Properly. Without being told to, she waited. He hasn't done that in a long time, William said. Apologize properly. He's a good kid, Clara said. He's working through something hard. They both are. William looked down at the paper in front of him. I know they are. A pause waited. I'm not particularly good at knowing what to do about it. It was the most he'd said about his actual interior state since she'd arrived. She understood that it cost him something. Saying it, she could hear the effort in the plainness of it, the deliberate lack of decoration. Show up every day, she said. I think for a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old that covers a great deal. Looked at her then. Not the sideways, peripheral look he usually gave her. Correct. Something moved in his face that she couldn't name, and he looked away again before she had time to try. Good night, Miss Whitmore, he said. Good night, Mr. Carter, she said, and picked up the dishes. In the kitchen, she stood for a moment, with her hands in the hot dishwater, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, not quite hope, which was too large and too exposed a word, but the smaller, more careful thing underneath it. Sense that maybe the thing you had built, the small, careful thing out of patience and good food and being present without pressing, was beginning to hold some weight. Grubbed the plates and did not let herself want anything yet. She had been wrong about things holding before. Lily started coming to the kitchen in the evenings. Not because she was asked, not because there was anything she needed. Just appeared, sometimes with a book, sometimes with nothing, sat at the end of the table while Clara cleaned up or prepared for the next day. She didn't always talk. Sometimes she read. Sometimes she watched what Clara was doing with the same serious attention she gave everything. Clara let her be there without making a fuss about it. She didn't ask why she'd come or try to draw her into conversation. She just continued doing what she was doing and acknowledged Lily's presence without turning it into a moment. Worked the way those things worked by not trying to make them work. One evening, Lily set her book down and watched Clara measure flour for the next morning's bread and said, "Did you always know how to cook?" "No," Clara said. "I learned from my mother mostly, and then from working in other people's kitchens. Got a lot of things wrong before I got them right." The hardest thing you ever had to make? Clara thought about it genuinely, because Lily asked questions like she expected genuine answers. Wedding cake for 40 people when the oven ran hot, and I didn't know it until the first one came out burned on the bottom. I had to remake 3 layers in under 2 hours, and I've never been more terrified in my life. Lily considered this. Did it turn out all right? It was fine, not perfect, but it was fine, and nobody said anything about it, because the bride was so happy she wasn't looking at the cake. "My mother used to make cake," Lily said. She said it the way children said the hardest things, not gradually building up to it, just placing it in the conversation and seeing what happened. Birthdays. It had orange in it. I don't remember what kind exactly. Clara kept measuring flour, slow and steady. That sounds like something worth remembering. Can't remember exactly. I try, but it keeps getting fuzzier. That's hard, Clara said simply. Lily looked at her book without reading it. Do you know how to make cake with orange in it? I know a few versions. I could try some things, if you ever wanted to see if any of them were close. Lily was quiet for a moment. Maybe sometime, she said, and picked her book back up. Clara wrote nothing that night in the recipe notebook. Some things didn't need to be recorded. They just needed to be held. The letter arrived on a Thursday in late November. Clara was in the general store. When she saw the man who delivered it, she didn't know at the time what he was carrying or what it would mean. She just noticed him because he was a stranger, which in Willow Creek was notable. Gan because there was something in the way he moved through the town that she recognized from somewhere she couldn't immediately place. Certain smoothness, a comfort with being watched, the walk of someone who was accustomed to arriving in places and being received. He went into the telegraph office. She finished her shopping and drove the wagon back to the ranch without thinking much more about it. But she should have thought about it. She should have paid more attention. Because the man's name was Gerald Foss. And Gerald Foss was the reason Clara Whitmore had left Kansas City 18 months ago in the middle of the night with nothing but the bag she could carry. She didn't know he was in Willow Creek until 4 days later, when Margaret Elroy came into the general store while Clara was there and said something to the woman behind the counter that Clara was only meant to partially hear. You know William Carter's cook has a past. Real kind of past. Gerald Foss has been telling people about it. Clara set down the jar she was holding. She didn't say anything. She paid for what she had, and she walked out of the store, and she stood in the cold street outside, and she understood, all at once, that the thing she had been building for 2 months, the careful patient, small thing built of cornbread and honesty and lamp adjustments, and Lily's orange cake question, and Ethan going to his father about the fence post, was now at risk in a way she had not been ready for. Gerald Foss did not tell the truth. That was not something he did. He told the version of the truth that served him, and then he repeated it until it hardened into something indistinguishable from fact. And she was in a new town, and nobody here knew her, which meant they would hear his version first, and first was almost always what stuck. She got on the wagon. She drove back to the ranch. She made dinner. She did not say anything yet, because she had not decided what to say. But that night, lying in the small room with the quilt and the window that looked toward the barn, she understood that the next few weeks were going to require everything she had. She had run before. Every other time she had run. This time, something in her that had been building slowly across 2 months of cold mornings and careful meals and a 7-year-old girl who couldn't remember exactly what her mother's orange cake tasted like that, something had grown just solid enough. That running didn't feel like the only option anymore. Felt for the first time in a long time like a choice rather than a foregone conclusion. She did not know yet what she was going to do. She just knew it would not be running. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind. In the house, settled around her in the dark. Somewhere down the hall a child turned in her sleep and made a small sound. Clara lay still and breathed and thought, not this time. Not again. She did not sleep well. That was the honest accounting of it. She lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind come off the mountains and turn itself against the side of the house. She ran through what she knew about Gerald Foss, the way you ran through an inventory you were afraid to find short, checking each item twice, hoping the count would come out better than you expected. Never did. Gerald Foss was 61 years old and had made a career of being believed. He was the kind of man who dressed carefully and spoke slowly and looked people in the eye a beat longer than was comfortable, which most people interpreted as sincerity, because they hadn't learned yet that sincerity and the performance of sincerity looked identical from the outside. He owned a hotel in Kansas City, or he had owned it. She supposed he still did a respectable 3-story establishment on a decent street where he charged decent prices and was considered a decent man by people who had no reason to look closer. Clara had worked in his kitchen for 11 months. She had learned slowly what kind of man he was underneath the careful presentation, what he wanted from the women in his employ, what happened when what he wanted was refused. She had refused, and she had left, and she had thought Kansas City was far enough behind her. She had been wrong about distances before. She should have known better. The kitchen was cold when she came down at 5 in the morning. She stoked the range and got it going and put water on for coffee and stood at the window watching the dark outside while she waited for the water to heat. The yard was invisible in the darkness, just the faint outline of the barn roof against a slightly lighter sky. One of the horses moved somewhere in there. She could hear it, a soft shifting sound. She had to decide something before the day started. That was the thing she kept coming back to. She had to decide what to do before Gerald Foss decided it for her, because men like him moved fast and they moved strategically, and waiting to see what he'd do was the same as handing him the advantage. She had 3 options as she saw it. She could say nothing and hope the rumors died before they reached William. She could go to William first and tell him her version. She could leave before it became his problem to manage. She poured the coffee when it was ready and sat at the kitchen table in the dark with her hands wrapped around the mug and thought about each one honestly. Saying nothing was not a strategy. It was a postponement. Rumors were already moving. She'd heard that much from Margaret Elroy's comment in the store. In a town this size, with the appetite they had for other people's business, it would reach William within the week whether she did anything or not. Arriving at that conversation with him, finding out first, rather than her telling him, would put her at the worst possible disadvantage. Leaving was what she'd done before, every other time. And every other time it had solved the immediate problem and created a version of the same problem somewhere else, 6 months later, because you could leave a town but you couldn't leave yourself. And the pattern of running had become its own kind of trap. She was 32 years old, and she was tired of being someone who ran. She was tired in a bone-level way that had nothing to do with sleep, which left the third option, which was also the hardest. She drank her coffee in the dark kitchen and listened to the house wake up around her, the creak of a floorboard above, one of the children turning over in a bed, distant sound of the ranch hands beginning their morning in the bunkhouse, and she made herself sit with the decision long enough that it stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like the only real path. She would tell William. Before anyone else did, she would tell him the truth, which was different from Gerald Foss's version, and which she could not prove, and she would let him make of it what he would. She had never done that before, given someone the full, unvarnished story and trusted them to hold it right. She had always managed information the way you managed limited supplies, parceling it out carefully, keeping the difficult parts for later or never, controlling what people knew so they couldn't use it against her. It hadn't worked. It had never actually worked. It had just felt safer. She got up and started on breakfast. The opportunity didn't come that morning. William came through the kitchen early, poured his own coffee before she could offer it, said a brief good morning, then was out the back door while she was still turning bacon in the pan. He had the look of a man with a full day already assembled in his head and not a spare moment in it. She watched him go and told herself the afternoon would do. Time. She just needed the right moment and a little privacy. What she didn't account for was Marcus Webb. Marcus came to the kitchen door, mid-morning, not the back door where the hands usually appeared, but the side door that opened onto the kitchen garden, which people only used when they didn't want to be seen coming. She noticed that. She noticed the way he pulled his hat off when she opened the door, which he didn't usually do. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "Marcus, do you need something?" He held his hat in both hands and looked at her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. "There was a man in town yesterday asking about you." Kept her voice level. "Was there?" "Name of Foss. Gerald Foss. He watched her face when he said the name. She kept it still. You know him? I know who he is. Talking to people. Marcus was choosing his words with unusual care. In the saloon. To some of the men from the other ranches. Saying things about you, about why you left Kansas City. A pause. I thought you ought to know. In case you didn't already. Kind of things, she said. And it came out as a statement rather than a question because she already knew the answer. Marcus looked uncomfortable. He was a decent man. She'd established that early on, not warm, not expansive, but fundamentally fair, with a directness that had never been unkind. Kind that don't do a person any favors, he said. He made it sound like there was something improper. In your conduct there. He stopped. I don't know if it's true. I don't know you well enough to know, but I thought you should know it was being said. Thank you, Marcus, she said. I appreciate you coming to tell me. He nodded, put his hat back on, and left through the side door. She closed it and stood for a moment with her hand on the latch. Saloon. He'd told the men in the saloon, which meant it was not a private whisper campaign, but a public declaration, which meant he wasn't trying to manage the information carefully. He was burning the field. Didn't want to pressure her quietly. He wanted to destroy the ground she was standing on before she had a chance to build anything on it. Told her something. That told her he knew she was here, knew she had a position worth having, and had decided the best move was scorched earth from the beginning. She went back to the stove. She finished the midday meal. She served it. She cleaned up. She did all of it with her hands steady, and her face composed, and her mind working underneath all of it like water moving under ice, looking for the way through. She found William in the south barn late in the afternoon, doing something with the tack that hung along the interior wall, cleaning it, untangling what needed untangling. A mindless sort of maintenance that she had come to understand he did when he needed to think without looking like he was thinking. She had watched him often enough to know his patterns. She stood at the barn door. The light was going already, the short November afternoon folding up early, and the inside of the barn was dim and smelled of leather and animal and hay. Carter, she said, I need to talk to you about something. Turned. Read her expression in the flat, careful way he had. All right, he said. He didn't tell her to come in. He didn't offer her a place to sit. He just turned and waited, which was all she needed, just the indication that he was willing to hear. Came in and stood a few feet away and said, There's a man in town named Gerald Foss, telling people things about me, about why I left my last position in Kansas City. I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it from someone else. He had set down whatever he'd been working on. His hands were still. All right, he said again. Same tone. Unreadable. I worked in his hotel kitchen for 11 months, Clara said. He was a difficult employer in ways I managed for most of that time. Toward the end of my time there, he wanted things from me that I was not willing to provide. I refused. He told me that if I left, he would make sure no one in Kansas City would employ me. She kept her voice even. Even was what she could manage. I left, anyway. I left in the middle of the night because I didn't trust him not to make trouble if I gave notice properly. Been telling people that the reason I left was conduct on my part, that there was something improper about my behavior in his household. That is not true, but I can't prove it isn't true. I can only tell you it isn't. The barn was quiet. One of the horses shifted. The wind worked at the loose boards on the east side. Gummow. William looked at her for a long moment. His expression was doing the complicated things she'd noticed that before, working through something, measuring something, and she could not tell at all what the measurement was coming out to. How long ago was this, he said. 18 months. I've worked in 2 positions since then. A boarding house in Colorado for 4 months and a ranch outside Cheyenne for 6. Why did you leave those? It was a fair question. She had known it would come. The boarding house closed, the owner sold it. Ranch in Cheyenne. I left because the family was moving to California and I didn't want to go that far. She paused. You can write to either of them. I can give you names. Kept the letters from both when I left. He nodded slowly. All right. She waited. He said nothing else immediately. Silence had a quality she couldn't read, not the hostile silence she'd expected, not the cold distance he retreated into when things were complicated, but something more like the silence of a man actually thinking, rather than a man who had already thought. I'll tell you the same thing I told you when you arrived, she said, when the quiet had gone on long enough. I intend to stay, and I intend to do a good job. I'm not asking you to take my word for something I can't prove. I'm asking you for the chance to show you who I am, which I've been doing since October and will keep doing. What you do with what I've told you is your decision, She turned to leave. Miss Whitmore. She stopped. I haven't told you this, William said, and I should have. Done more for this household in 2 months than anyone since. He stopped. Started again. My daughter asked me this week if I thought you'd stay. She's 7 years old, and she was trying to figure out how to ask without it sounding like she cared, which is exactly the way I do most things too, so I recognized it. Clara turned back around. I don't know what Foss is saying, and I don't know the full situation, William said. What I know is what I've watched, and what I've watched doesn't leave me much room to doubt you. A pause. That's all I have to say about it. She stood in the barn in the failing afternoon light and felt something that was too large and too exposed to look at directly, so she didn't look at it directly. Thank you, she said. I mean that. Go start dinner, he said, not unkindly. It's going to be cold tonight. She went. She had thought, after that conversation, that there would be some breathing room. That having told William and having him respond the way he did would buy her time to figure out the next move with Foss. She had not anticipated how fast Margaret Elroy could move when she had something worth moving on. 2 days later, when Clara went to town for supplies and found the atmosphere in the general store changed in the way that meant people had been talking. The woman behind the counter, a Mrs. Hatch, who had always been professionally neutral, who had never been unkind, was distant in a new and deliberate way. She answered Clara's requests in short sentences and did not look up from what she was doing in the spaces between. 2 other women in the store found reasons to be on the opposite side of it from Clara within 60 seconds of her coming in. Clara did her shopping. She did not hurry, because hurrying would look like fleeing, and she was not fleeing. She took her time with each item on her list, and she moved through the store with her shoulders back and her expression composed, and she did not look for approval from anyone in the room because she had stopped doing that a long time ago. What she could not control was what she heard on her way out. Margaret Elroy was on the porch, talking to a man Clara didn't recognize, and she did not lower her voice when Clara came through the door. A woman like that, living alone in a man's house with his children, and now we know why she keeps moving from town to town. Can't imagine what he's thinking. Clara stopped on the porch. She had not planned to stop. She had planned to go straight to the wagon. Something in her the same, something that had decided 2 nights ago it was done with running, made her stop and turn. Margaret Elroy saw her, and had the small, brief expression of someone who has been caught and is not sure whether to be embarrassed or defiant, and then settled on defiant because it was more comfortable. I can hear you, Clara said. Quietly, clearly, I suspect you know that. Margaret's chin went up. I'm entitled to my opinion. You are, Clara said, and I'm entitled to tell you that what Gerald Foss told you isn't true. I know you'll believe what you want to believe, regardless of what I say. But I want you to know I'm aware of what's being said and who's saying it, and I'm still here. She got in the wagon and drove. Her hands were not steady on the reins. Were shaking, finally, in the way they shook when the adrenaline had nowhere to go. She let them shake. She pointed the horse toward the ranch and let the motion of the wagon do what it always did, the rhythm of it coming up through the boards, steady and relentless and indifferent to what she was feeling. She had said her piece. She had not run. She had not apologized. She had not given Margaret Elroy the satisfaction of either anger or tears, which were the 2 things people like Margaret wanted most because both of them confirmed the story already assembled in their heads. She had just said, I'm still here. She kept saying it in her head on the drive back. I'm still here. I'm still here. Like something she was trying to convince herself of. Children were already home when she got back, which meant she was later than she'd intended. Which meant she could see the small shadow of worry on Lily's face. When she came in through the kitchen door, the particular expression Lily wore when things had not followed the pattern she expected. You're late, Lily said. I got held up in town, Clara said, setting her bags on the table. I'm sorry, did you eat anything? Ethan made toast, Lily said, which explained the faint smell of slightly scorched bread in the kitchen. Burned it. Toast is tricky, Clara said, hanging up her coat. Gah, he said it wasn't. Frequently say that. Began unpacking the bags, moving at her normal pace, letting the kitchen do what the kitchen did give her hands something to do, give the room some activity, ease the tension that had been with her since the store. Where's your father? Still out. He said 7 for dinner. Good. I have time then. She looked at Lily, who was watching her with that careful, serious attention. Are you all right? I'm all right, Lily said. Are you all right? Question landed cleanly, with the directness children had when they were paying attention, and nobody had taught them yet to soften it. Clara looked at the girl for a moment, 7 years old, and already carrying too much, already watching too carefully, already braced for things to change. I had a hard afternoon, Clara said, because lying to her was something she was not willing to do. But I'm all right. I'm here. Lily looked at her for another moment, decided something, and sat down at the end of the table in her usual spot. Can I stay while you cook? You can always stay, Clara said. You know that. Started on dinner, and Lily sat in her chair and didn't say much. Like the kitchen, gradually filled with the sound smells of cooking, Clara felt some of the tightness of the afternoon begin to release, not go away, but redistribute, become something she could carry rather than something that was carrying her. Gerald Foss came to the ranch on a Thursday. She didn't know he was coming. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horse in the yard, which was not unusual. People came and went from the ranch throughout the day on various business. But then she heard William's voice from the front of the house, through the wall, and something in the register of it made her go still. She couldn't hear the words. She could hear the tone. William was keeping his voice level and deliberate in the way he did when he was controlling something, not hiding it, just holding it in, shaping it into something manageable. She heard a second voice, smother, slower, accustomed to being listened to. She wiped her hands on her apron and came through the hallway to the front of the house. She did not run. She walked at her normal pace and turned the corner into the front hall and found William standing at the open front door and Gerald Foss standing on the porch. He looked exactly as she remembered him. That was the first disorienting thing about it, that a person you'd been afraid of could just look like themselves. Unchained. Ordinary, slightly overdressed for rural Wyoming in a dark wool coat and a city man's hat. He was heavier than she remembered, or maybe that was just the coat. His eyes, when they found her, were immediately satisfied, which was the thing she'd always hated most about him, the satisfaction he took in other people's discomfort, worn openly, because he'd never found anyone to make him hide it. Miss Whitmore, he said, pleasant as a storefront. Didn't know you'd be right here, Mr. Foss, she said. I was just talking to Mr. Carter here about you. He smiled at William with the warmth of a man at a business meeting, hoping he had all the necessary information about the person he'd hired. William had not moved from his position in the doorway, not stepped back to let Foss in. That was deliberate, she knew. That was William doing the thing he did with his body when he wanted to say something without saying it. I think I've heard what I need to hear, William said. Well, now I'm not sure you have. Foss kept his tone even, kept the pleasantness up like a wall. A man in your position, with children in the house, needs to know the full picture about the people he employs. I'm only trying to help. Is that what you're doing? William said. Not a question. I'm sure Miss Whitmore told you her version of things. Foss's eyes went to Clara again. Not threatening. Worse than threatening, dismissive, the way you looked at something you'd already decided was manageable. She's a capable woman, very convincing. That was part of the trouble in Kansas City. Clara said, What exactly did you tell people in town, Gerald? Use of his first name made something move in his face. Not much, but enough I told the truth, he said. That you left my employ under difficult circumstances. That there were questions about your conduct. You told people I was a woman of loose character, Clara said. That's not the truth. That's a story you built, because I wouldn't give you what you wanted. And you've been telling it for a year and a half, because it's easier than admitting what you actually did. Pleasantness cracked. Just slightly. Just at the edges, where the effort of holding it became visible. Miss Whitmore, I don't think you want to be making accusations. I'm not making accusations, she said. I'm telling Mr. Carter, in your presence, what happened. You can disagree with my account if you'd like. Foss looked at William. The salesman quality came back into his face, the performance of reasonableness, the man-to-man appeal. See how she is, he said. This is exactly, I think we're done here, William said. Foss blinked. I beg your pardon? I said we're done. William's voice was the cold, controlled kind. Not raised, not angry in any theatrical sense. Just absolutely final. You've come out here to my property to talk about my employee. A woman who told me this conversation was likely coming and told me her account of what happened between you. I've heard what she said, and I've had 2 months to watch how she conducts herself. He paused. I'm not interested in your version. I'd like you to leave. Foss stood on the porch and looked at William with the expression of a man recalibrating. He had not expected this. He had expected. Clara knew. A standard dynamic, a man in William's position, hearing a story about a woman in her position, and believing the man because that was what people generally did. He had not adjusted for what 2 months in this household had been building toward. "You're making a mistake," Foss said. "Quieter now." "Pleasantness gone." "Possibly," William said. "Goodbye, Mr. Foss." Foss looked at Clara one last time. The look had nothing pleasant in it now. "I haven't heard the last of this," he said. "I've heard that before too," she said. Left. They stood in the hallway and listened to him mount his horse and ride out of the yard. When the sound had faded into the distance, William turned from the door and looked at her, and Clara stood where she was, and realized her heart was hammering in a way that was entirely out of proportion to how steady she'd sounded through all of it. "You all right?" William asked. "I don't know yet," she said. He nodded like that was an acceptable answer. He reached past her and took his work coat off the hook by the door and shrugged into it. "I've got to get back to the South Field. We're short on time before dark." He stopped with his hand on the door. "He's not going to let this go." "I know," she said. "All right." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "So we'll deal with it." He went out. She stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the sound of him cross the porch and go down the steps, listening to the yard receive him and the ranch go on in its ordinary afternoon way, entirely unaltered. "We'll deal with it." She turned that over in her mind the way you turned over something you were not entirely sure was real, examining it from different angles, testing the weight of it. Could not remember the last time someone had said "we" in relation to a problem she was carrying. She could not remember the last time someone had stood at a door and told a man like Gerald Foss that they'd heard enough and he could leave. She went back to the kitchen. She checked the stove, started the bread she'd been about to start before the sound of hooves in the yard. Her hands were steadier than they'd been in days. Outside, the afternoon was going dark and cold, and the wind was picking up off the mountains in the way it did this time of year. Somewhere down the road, Gerald Foss was riding back toward Willow Creek with the first refusal he'd received in a very long time sitting on him. Clara knew with the same certainty she knew her own heartbeat that he was going to do something about it. She did not know yet what. She did not know what shape the next problem would take. She was still here. She was in this kitchen with bread to make and a fire to keep and 2 children who would be home from school in an hour, and she was still here. For now, that was enough. Gerald Foss did not come back to the ranch. That was the first thing Clara noticed in the days that followed the absence of a direct second move, the quiet that settled in after his visit like snow after a storm, surface clean and deceiving. She had expected something immediate, a return, an escalation, some frontal action that she could see coming and brace for. What she had not expected was the sideways approach, kind that didn't announce itself. It started small enough that she almost missed it. Feed store in town began charging the Carter Ranch a slightly longer wait for orders, nothing that could be called refusal, just a persistent delay that added up across 2 weeks to real inconvenience. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Donnelly, who'd been with the operation 3 seasons, gave his notice on a Tuesday with no explanation beyond a vague reference to other opportunities. Though Marcus Webb told William privately that Donnelly had been seen drinking with men from the Foss circle the weekend before. The banker's wife, a woman named Eleanor Pruitt, who had previously given Clara a polite nod when their paths crossed in town, now simply looked elsewhere when Clara came near. None of it was provable. None of it was the kind of thing you could point to and say, "This is Gerald Foss doing this." It was the work of a man who had done this before and knew exactly how much pressure to apply before it crossed the line into something someone might push back against. Clara watched it happen and said nothing because saying something required evidence, and she had only patterns, and patterns were not the kind of thing that held up when you laid them out in front of someone. William noticed the feed store situation. He mentioned it once at dinner in a flat observational way, not connecting it to Foss directly, or not out loud. Clara looked at her plate and said nothing. And William looked at her, looking at her plate, and she knew he had made the same connection she had. Silently, sat with it between them unsaid, because saying it would require deciding what to do about it, and neither of them had that answer yet. Children, for their part, knew something was wrong in the elastic. Wordless way children knew things, not the specifics, but the weather of it. Ethan became quieter in the evenings, watchful. Lily stayed in the kitchen longer and asked more questions than usual, the way she did when she was anxious and needed the sound of conversation to anchor her. She asked Clara about Kansas City one night while Clara was crimping the edges of a pie. What was it like? Was it very large? Were there many hotels there? Clara answered carefully, keeping her voice even, giving Lily the ordinary geography of it without the parts underneath. Did you like it there? Lily asked. Parts of it, Clara said. River was nice in the mornings. Why did you leave? Clara pressed her thumb along the edge of the crust. Time, she said. Sometimes places feel done. Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything. Do you think you'll feel done here? The question was so direct and so nakedly worried that Clara had to stop what she was doing for a moment. She looked at the girl, the dark eyes, the careful expression, the smallness of her at the kitchen table, trying to hold herself very still so the answer wouldn't knock her sideways. Don't feel done here, Clara said. Not even close. Lily looked at the table and then looked back up. Okay, she said. Like it was not a small thing she was accepting, which it wasn't. It was Marcus who came to Clara the following week with the thing that changed the shape of what Foss was doing. He found her in the kitchen garden in the cold mid-morning, cutting the last of the late herbs before the next hard freeze took them. Came through the side gate the way he had the first time, hat in hand, and she knew from the way he carried himself that whatever he'd come to say was larger than the Donnelly situation. There's a meeting, he said without preamble. Tuesday evening. The town hall. About the Carter Ranch water rights. Clara went still. The water rights. There's a claim being made that the eastern irrigation line runs across the property boundary. That part of it sits on public land and was never properly filed. He turned his hat. Foss has been talking to the land office, to Judge Haller. Men who own the parcels east and south of here. Who's making the claim? Foss's name isn't on the paperwork, Marcus said. There's a man named Dent owns 300 acres on the eastern side. He's the one with the formal complaint. But he's been seen having dinners with Foss at the hotel twice this week. Clara looked at the herbs in her hand and thought very clearly and carefully for a long moment. How serious is this? The eastern line carries water to about 40% of the grazing land, Marcus said. If they establish that the irrigation infrastructure crosses the boundary without proper filing, they can demand its removal or purchase it at county assessment value, which wouldn't cover the cost of building an alternative. He paused. Mr. Carter doesn't know yet. I found out this morning. I came here first. She understood why he had come to her first, and did not know entirely what to do with that understanding that Marcus Webb, who had looked at her with flat assessment on the day she arrived, who had kept a careful and neutral distance for 3 months, had brought this to her before he brought it to his employer. She did not ask him why. She folded the herbs and straightened. Needs to know today, she said. I know it. Come in. Have coffee. I'll go find him. She found William in the north barn doing the same tack work he did when he needed to think. Gautam. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment before she spoke, because she needed a second to put what she was going to say in the right order. We have a problem, she said. He turned. He read something in her face immediately. How bad? Bad enough that Marcus came to tell me before he came to tell you, which means he thought I needed to know first. She told him everything Marcus had told her, the same way Marcus had told her plainly, without softening the edges or managing his reaction. Deserved the plain version. He stood very still through all of it. Muscle at the side of his jaw worked twice. That was all. Tuesday, he said. Tuesday evening. He set down what he was holding and came toward the door. She stepped aside to let him pass, and he stopped next to her, not looking at her directly, looking out at the yard. Went after my water rights, he said, more to himself than to her. Came here, I turned him away, so he went after my water rights. That's what it looks like. Because of you. She had been waiting for that. She had been carrying it since Marcus left. She kept her voice level. Because you stood at your door and sent him away without what he came for. What he came for was my humiliation, and you didn't give it to him. She paused. That's something you regret. I understand it. He looked at her then, direct the same way he'd looked at her in the barn after Foss's visit. Don't regret it, he said. I'm telling you what's happening so you understand the full picture. Not to blame you for it. The full picture, she said, is that Gerald Foss was going to be a problem for this ranch one way or another once he knew I was here. If I had left, he would have found another angle. This is what men like him do. They find whatever you have that can be taken, and they lean on it. Water rights were there before I arrived. He was quiet for a moment. Dealt with men like him before. I have, she said. Left every other time. I'm not leaving this time, but I also understand that you didn't hire me to bring this kind of trouble to your door. No, William said. I hired you to cook. He said it in a way that was not dismissive, just honest and precise. Things change in 3 months. The landscape of a thing changes. He turned back toward the house. I need to talk to Marcus, and then I need to find my land documents. Land documents lived in a tin box under the desk. In the front room, Clara knew this because she had dusted that desk every week for 3 months and had never moved the box, which had the specific weight and placement of something significant that had not been opened in a while. William pulled it out that evening, after dinner, after the children were in bed, and spread the contents across the desk in the lamplight. Clara came in with 2 cups of coffee and set one beside him. She started to leave. Stay, not a command. More like the word came out before he waited. She stayed, sat in the chair across the desk, and watched him work through the paper's original land grant, survey documents, filings with the county office, correspondence with the previous owner from whom he'd bought the property 8 years ago. His hands moved through them with the same focused steadiness he brought to everything physical, but she could see in the set of his shoulders that what he was finding was not entirely reassuring. Eastern line, he said finally, without looking up. It's filed. My predecessor filed it. But the filing reference in this document is to a county record from 1871, and I don't have a copy of that record here. He picked up a letter. My deed references it but doesn't reproduce it, which means if that county record doesn't exist, or if it was improperly filed, or if it's been lost, he set the letter down. Then Dent's complaint has a leg to stand on, not a certainty. Something. Can the county office produce the original record? Still exists. He picked up the coffee and drank. People lose things. County offices are not exempt. You need to find out before Tuesday, Clara said. If the record exists and it's properly filed, you go to the meeting with that. If it doesn't, I need a lawyer in about 3 weeks I don't have. He rubbed the back of his neck. There's an attorney in Laramie, Theodore Marsh. I've dealt with him on other things. Trustworthy. He looked at the papers spread across the desk. I'll send a wire in the morning. Clara looked at the documents too, as if looking at them might reveal something useful. She had no legal knowledge. She knew how to run a kitchen and how to manage difficult people and how to survive. But property law was not in her vocabulary. What she did have was the habit, built over years, of thinking practically about problems when feeling things about them was a luxury she couldn't afford. There's something else, she said. He looked up. The people at that Tuesday meeting, the ones Foss has been working. They're not all acting against you by conviction. Some of them are acting against you because he's given them a version of events that makes it seem reasonable. Dent's situation is legal, but the atmosphere around it is social, and social can be changed. She paused. Who do you trust in this town? He thought about it. Not quickly, which she respected. Doc Greer, Frank Alderman at the telegraph office. Reeves family, 3 miles east. Pearl Whitfield. Pearl Whitfield, the seamstress? She's been here since before I was born. Her husband helped my father build the main house. A pause. Why? Because if there are people in this town who know you and trust you, they should know what Foss's involvement actually is before Tuesday. Not as a campaign, just they should know the real shape of what's happening. She kept her voice careful. Gah, what looks like a water rights complaint looks different when people know who's been having dinner with Dent. William looked at her for a long moment. You're saying I should talk to them. I'm saying you know people here who'll hear you straight. And right now Foss has had several days to tell his version to anyone who'll listen. She picked up her coffee. I've learned the hard way that silence doesn't protect you. Just leaves the space open for someone else's story to fill it. Quiet for a moment that stretched long enough for her to wonder if she'd gone too far, pushed past the line of what was her place, and into something that was none of her business. Right, he said. I hate that you're right. I know, she said. Something almost like a smile crossed his face, quickly. Gone before it fully arrived. He turned back to the documents. Get some sleep, Miss Whitmore. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Ah. She took the coffee cups back to the kitchen and washed them, and stood at the window in the dark for a moment. The yard was empty and cold. The mountains were invisible beyond the dark, just a presence she knew was there, because she'd learned the shape of them. She thought about what it meant that she'd told him what to do, and he'd listened. Not dismissed it. Not explained to her why things worked differently here than she thought, not managed her back toward the kitchen and her proper concern. He had heard her, and then said she was right. She turned off the kitchen lamp and went to bed. Next 3 days moved fast and unevenly, the way days moved when things were in motion that you couldn't fully control. William rode to the county office himself on Monday morning and was there when it opened. Came back in the early afternoon with his expression arranged carefully, and told Clara, when she asked directly, that the 1871 county record existed, but had been misfiled in a different ledger and had only been located after 2 hours of searching. It had a copy now. The filing was proper. The Eastern Irrigation Line was legitimately registered. That was the good news. The other news was that Judge Haller had been the one to process Dent's complaint. Judge Haller. Marcus confirmed through channels that Marcus had and didn't explain. He had been at one of the dinners with Foss and Dent. "He's not a corrupt man," William said that evening, sitting at the kitchen table while Clara made tomorrow's bread. "He's a man who likes having people think well of him, which Foss is very good at engineering. Haller won't rule wrong on a clear matter of law, but on something with ambiguity, he'll lean the direction of the people whose opinion he values." "Right now Foss has his opinion," Clara said. "Right now Foss has his opinion," William said. She shaped the bread dough and set it to rise. "Did you talk to Frank Alderman?" "This afternoon." "And Doc Greer?" "And I'll ride to the Reeves place tomorrow morning before the meeting." He was holding a cup of coffee and not drinking it, which was his particular habit when he was working through something. "We're surprised. Not about Foss, about me. About the fact that I came to tell them." "Men like you don't usually ask for help," she said. Looked at her with a small wry expression. "Men like me," he repeated. "Know what I mean. I do." He set the cup down. "My father was the same way. Needed help, never asked for it, suffered for not asking." A pause. Peculiar kind of pride. Feels like dignity, functions like something else. It was the most candid thing he'd said to her about himself in 3 months. She did not make a large thing of it. She just continued with the bread and let him have said it without requiring him to elaborate or take it back. "Frank Alderman had something useful," William said after a moment. "Seen the telegrams Foss has been sending. Not the content, he doesn't read private correspondence. The volume and the destinations. Foss has been in contact with someone in Denver. Likely a lawyer or a land broker." He paused. "This isn't just about me sending him away. Bigger than that." Clara looked up from the bread. "He wants the water rights themselves. That's what I think. Eastern Irrigation Line covers enough of the grazing land that whoever controls it controls a significant portion of what makes this ranch viable. If he can force a legal dispute about the filing and get a county ruling, even a temporary injunction while I'm fighting it." He didn't finish the sentence. "Didn't need to. He's trying to make you sell," she said. "Or force a price on me for the infrastructure that I can't pay." He looked at his hands. "He has more money than I do. He can sustain a legal fight longer. That's the play. Not a quick win. Attrition." She stood with her hands in the dough and thought about Gerald Foss standing on the porch of this house, smooth and pleasant, telling William he was only trying to help. The long-game quality of what he'd built since being turned away the feed delays. Donnelly's departure, Dent's complaint, dinners with Haller, each piece small enough to question individually. Together a systematic erosion of everything William had. She had been the occasion for it. She had not caused it. She understood that distinction clearly, had worked hard to hold it clearly since the first conversation with Marcus. She had been the occasion, and the occasion of a fire was not the same as the cause of it, but it still had to live with what it had set off. "Tell me something," she said. He looked at her. "If I had left. November, when he first showed up in town, before he came to the ranch. Would this still be happening?" He considered it honestly, which was the thing she'd come to trust about him. He didn't answer too fast. "Probably," he said. "Maybe slower. Maybe with a different shape. But Foss has been sniffing around Wyoming land for a while. Marcus told me he's had dealings with 2 other ranches in this part of the territory in the last 2 years. One sold. One is still fighting. So I was the lever he used, but the pressure was there regardless." "That's my read," he said. She went back to the bread. Dough was ready, and she began shaping it, pressing and folding with the rhythm that she found as steadying as anything. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow night, then." "Tomorrow night," he agreed. Town hall in Willow Creek was a single large room used for meetings, voting, and the occasional dance. By the time William and Clara arrived on Tuesday evening, it was fuller than Clara had expected, perhaps 40 people, arranged on bench seats facing the front table where Judge Haller sat with 2 county officials and, end of the row, a man she understood to be Dent. Was younger than she'd imagined, broad and sunburned, wearing the expression of someone who had been told he was in the right and was trying to hold on to that certainty in a crowded room. Gerald Foss was not at the table. He was in the 3rd row on the left, next to Margaret Elroy, which Clara noted with a cold, clear assessment. He dressed, as always, like a man at a business meeting. He saw Clara when she came in, and his expression went briefly to the satisfied quality she hated, and then adjusted to something more neutral when he saw who was behind her. William came in after her, and then Marcus. And this was the thing that changed the temperature of the room. Frank Alderman came and sat directly behind William. Doc Greer came in from the other side and sat 3 rows back. And Pearl Whitfield, 73 years old, and carrying herself like she owned the floor under her feet, who came in and sat down in the front row on the right, and looked at Judge Haller like she was waiting for him to say something interesting. Haller noticed. He noticed all of it. Clara watched him notice and saw him recalibrate just slightly, just enough that someone watching closely would see it. Proceeding began with a county official reading the formal complaint. Dent's claim was laid out precisely, that the eastern irrigation infrastructure crossed the property boundary at 2 points, that the original county filing was unverifiable, and that the county should assess the situation and determine ownership. William sat with his copy of the retrieved 1,871 record in his hands. When Haller asked for his response, he stood up and said clearly, "Original filing exists, Judge. I have a certified copy here. I retrieved it from the county ledger myself on Monday. County clerk who assisted me is here if the court wants her confirmation." There was a shifting in the room, the kind of shift that had happened when a narrative tilted. Haller asked for the document. It was passed forward. He looked at it carefully, then passed it to the county official beside him. Dent leaned over and said something to the man next to him. From the 3rd row, Gerald Foss said, pleasantly, "If the filing is legitimate, concern remains about the precise survey line. Document from 1,871 may not reflect the current boundary markers." Haller looked at Foss. So did half the room. And Clara, watching, saw the moment Pearl Whitfield turned in her front row seat and looked at Gerald Foss with the flat, considered attention of a woman who had lived in this town for 50 years and had seen several men like him come and go, said, in a voice that carried clearly, "Who are you, exactly?" "I don't know you." The simplest possible question. It was also in a room where Pearl Whitfield's opinion carried the weight of decades, devastating. Because it named what he was: a stranger, an outsider, a man with no history here who had been pulling strings in a town that wasn't his. Foss turned toward her with the smooth appeal he kept ready. "Gerald Foss, ma'am, I have business interests in the territory." "I didn't ask about your business interests," Pearl said. "I asked who you are." She turned back to the front. The room had changed again. Clara felt it, the small, significant shift in atmosphere that happened when someone named a thing that everyone had sensed but not said. Doc Greer, 3 rows back, said nothing, but he crossed his arms and looked at the front table with the expression of a man settled into a position. Frank Alderman, behind William, leaned forward slightly. Calder looked at the document again. He looked at Dent, looked at the room, not at Foss, significantly, and then he said, "The filing appears to be in order. Without a formal survey challenge, which would require new evidence beyond what's been presented today, I don't find grounds to proceed with an injunction." He looked at Dent directly. "If you want to commission a new survey, that's your right. But I'm not issuing a hold on the Carter water rights based on today's complaint." Dent looked at the man beside him. He looked briefly and involuntarily at Gerald Foss. Said nothing. "This matter is tabled," Haller said, and closed the ledger. The room began moving. People stood, spoke to one another, found their coats. Clara stayed where she was for a moment, watching Foss across the room. He was talking to Dent close, low, with the intensity of a man revising his plan rather than abandoning it. It was not done. She knew that as surely as she knew anything. But tonight, in this room, he had not gotten what he came for. Pearl Whitfield appeared beside Clara without announcement. She was a small woman, considerably shorter than Clara, with white hair and the bright, direct eyes of someone whose attention was still entirely her own. She looked at Clara for a moment, with an assessment that was different from the kind Clara usually received, not suspicious, not dismissive. Measuring, but in a different direction. "You're the cook at the Carter Ranch," Pearl said. "Clara Whitmore," Clara said. "Yes, I've heard things about you," Pearl said. "Various things from various people." "I imagine so," Clara said. "You know what I've noticed? In 73 years of listening to various people say various things?" Pearl looked at Gerald Foss across the room. A man who works that hard to make sure everyone hears his version of a story is usually a man who knows the real version is worse. Clara looked at the old woman beside her. "That has been my experience as well." Pearl made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction. William Carter is a stubborn, difficult man who doesn't ask for help when he should and takes on too much and keeps too much inside him. He was like that at 15, and he's like that now. She paused. Also one of the most honest people I know in this county. When he brought people to that meeting tonight, he was asking for something. Doesn't do that. She looked at Clara. Someone told him to. Clara said nothing. Good, Pearl said, as if that answered something. She nodded once, a small decisive movement, and went to find her coat. They drove back to the ranch in the dark, William and Clara on the wagon, Marcus following behind on horseback. Cold had settled hard, and the stars were clear, and the horse knew the road well enough that it needed little direction. For a long time neither of them spoke. Victory of the evening, if it could be called that, which Clara was not certain it could. Given that Foss was already revising rather than retreating, sat between them unexamined. Way you let a hot thing cool before you picked it up. Pearl Whitfield talked to you, William said finally. She did. What did she say? Mostly what she thought of you. Clara kept her eyes on the road ahead. Favorable. He made a short sound, something between acknowledgement and embarrassment. She knew my mother. She has opinions about everything I've done since I was 12 years old. She seems like a woman worth knowing. She is a pause. She also told me, 3 years ago, when I was at my worst after Eleanor died, that I had better not let the grief swallow me entirely, because I had 2 children who needed someone to be standing upright. He said it plainly, the way he sometimes said the hardest things, without decoration. I was not grateful for that at the time. Were you later? Eventually. He shifted the reins. It took a while. The wagon moved through the dark. She could smell the cold and the sage and the faint distant smell of wood smoke from some homestead they were passing. Tonight isn't over, she said, not asking, just naming what they both knew. No, he agreed. Haller tabled it, which is different from closing it. Foss commissions a new survey and finds anything ambiguous, it comes back. He has the money to commission as many surveys as he needs. A pause. Marsh. The lawyer in Laramie, I need to get him involved. Have everything documented and defended before the next round. That will cost. Yes. He said it like a man who had already done the arithmetic and was not happy with the answer. Cost. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have some money saved. From the past 3 months and from before. It's not... She stopped. It's not a large amount. But if it would help with the legal fee. No, he said immediately and firmly. No. That's yours. I won't take that. I'm not giving it away. I'm lending it. Clara. He said her name. Her first name, which he almost never did, and the unexpectedness of it made her go still. No, he said more gently. I appreciate it. I mean that sincerely. But no, she let it go. The offer had been genuine and the refusal was also genuine, and there was nothing more to say about it. Nah. They rode the rest of the way in the kind of silence that had changed from the silences at the beginning of all this, no longer the silence of 2 people who did not know each other, but the silence of 2 people who were tired in the same direction after a long day of the same fight. Nah. When they reached the ranch, the children were asleep, the house dark except for the lamp in the front hall that she always left burning. Clara unhitched the horse with William while Marcus put away his own animal and called a short good night, and then Marcus went to the bunkhouse, and it was just the 2 of them in the dark yard. It was a good night, William said, looking at the house. All things considered. It was, she agreed. Foss will try something else. I know. Turned and looked at her in the dark, and she couldn't see his expression clearly. Just the outline of him, the shape of a man who'd been through a long day and was still standing in it. I want you to know something, he said. I want to say it plainly because I haven't, and I should have. He paused, with the characteristic pause of a man choosing his words because he meant them. You belong here. Whatever else happens, with Foss or the water rights, or what the town thinks you belong here, and I should have said it before tonight. Cold air was sharp enough to make her eyes sting, or she told herself that was the reason. Thank you, she said, not helplessly, not overwhelmed. Just meaning it. He nodded once and went inside. She stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the lamp in the window. Then she followed him in and locked the door against the cold and went upstairs to her room where the quilt was folded at the foot of the bed. She sat on the edge of it in the dark and thought about what it meant that someone had said she belonged somewhere and that she had believed it. Not hoped it was true. Not suspected it might be true. Believed it, the way you believed in the weight of things you could hold in your hands. Outside, the Wyoming wind worked at the house the same as always, finding the gaps, testing the seams, looking for anything not properly fastened. The house held. It had been built to hold. She lay down without undressing and stared at the ceiling and let the quiet of the ranch settle over her and thought, Foss is not finished. He will come again with something new, and when he does, this time, she will not be facing it alone. Thought, plain and undecorated, was more than she had walked into most of her life with. Was, she decided, enough to sleep on. She had been right that Foss was not finished. She had known it on the wagon ride home, had known it lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. She knew it in the days that followed, when the quiet stretched on just long enough to feel like something was being loaded rather than something being over. New survey arrived in the second week of December. William told her about it over coffee on a Thursday morning before the children came down a certified letter from the county office, delivered by a writer from town, informing him that a private land survey had been commissioned by a party whose name was listed as Holt Property Associates, a corporate entity registered in Denver, and that the survey would be conducted along the eastern and southern property boundaries of the Carter Ranch during the week of December 19th. County was obligated to inform him. He was not obligated to allow it, but challenging it would require a court filing, and a court filing required Theodore Marsh, and Marsh had already sent his retainer fee, which William had paid out of the ranch's operating account and not mentioned to Clara until now. She read the letter twice. Holt Property Associates, she said. No Holt I know of in Wyoming land dealings, William said. Foss. Behind a company name so his fingerprints aren't directly on it. Can Marsh find out? For certain. He's working on it. Denver incorporation records are public, but accessing them from here takes time. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. In the meantime, the survey goes forward, because I have no legal ground to stop it. What does Marsh think they're looking for? Anything. Any discrepancy between the 1,871 filing and the current physical markers. Survey pins move. Fences get rebuilt in slightly different places. After 50 years of settling and weather and whoever's worked that land, there are sometimes differences between what a document says and where things actually stand. He paused. If they find a discrepancy, even a minor one, they can use it to reopen Dent's complaint and request a formal readjudication. Clara looked at the letter in her hands and thought about all the things she knew how to do and how very few of them applied to this particular situation. She could manage a difficult kitchen. She could navigate hostile rooms. She could tell a person the truth when it was the last thing they wanted to hear. She could not make survey pins stay where they were supposed to be. She could not make 50-year-old documents more precise than they were. She could not reach into a Denver incorporation registry and pull out Gerald Foss's name. Is there anything we can do before December 19th? She said. I'm having Marcus walk the eastern line this week with the 1,871 measurements. If there are discrepancies, I want to know before they do. He picked up the letter and folded it back into its envelope. And Marsh is petitioning to have a Carter representative present during the survey. Can't refuse that. It's standard. Who goes? Marcus. He knows that land better than anyone. She nodded. Then she said, You're carrying a lot of this alone. Looked at her. I have Marsh. I have Marcus. I mean the rest of it. She was careful with how she said it, not wanting to push into something he hadn't invited. Parts that don't have a legal answer or a practical task attached. It was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Ethan on the stairs, the specific tread of a 9-year-old trying to come down quietly and not managing it. William looked at the door and then back at his coffee. I'm used to it, he said. I know, she said. I'm used to carrying things alone, too. Doesn't make it lighter. He didn't answer that. Ethan came into the kitchen, and the morning reorganized itself around breakfast, and the children's preparations for school and the ordinary business of a ranch morning, and the conversation folded away. She had said it, and he had heard it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Marcus walked the eastern line on Friday and Saturday. On Sunday evening, he came to the kitchen door with mud on his boots and a look on his face that said the news was not entirely good. William was at the front room desk. Clara brought Marcus through and stood near the kitchen door while he laid it out. There were 2 places, Marcus said, where the current fence line did not precisely match the 1,871 measurements. Not significant deviations, a matter of yards at the most, but deviations nonetheless. At one point, the fence appeared to sit about 4 yards further east than the original filing indicated, meaning a small section of fence and the irrigation channel running beneath it would be technically on the wrong side of the line if the 1,871 document was taken as absolute. 4 yards. The width of this kitchen, roughly. 4 yards of Wyoming ground that could, in the hands of a man with enough money for lawyers and enough patience for attrition, become the edge of a lever. Could it be natural drift? William asked. Wind settling? Someone restringing the line at some point? Could be, Marcus said. That's the honest answer. These lines get rebuilt after hard winters. Whoever did it last might have been working from visual reference rather than measurements. William sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Clara had learned to read that. Look, it meant he was doing arithmetic in his head, the kind where none of the numbers came out right. Marsh needs to know, William said finally. I'll wire him in the morning, Marcus said. After Marcus left, William stayed at the desk, and Clara brought him coffee he hadn't asked for and set it down without comment. Picked it up without comment. They had developed, over 4 months, a particular economy of gesture that required less explaining than talking. 4 yards, he said. It's not much, she said. It's enough. He turned the coffee mug in his hands. The hands of a judge who wants a reason. It's enough. She sat down in the chair across from him, the way she had the night of the land documents. Tell me what the worst case looks like. He looked at her. Why? Because I find it easier to think about bad things when I've already looked at them instead of trying not to. Pause. Then, worst case, the survey finds the deviation. Foss uses it to get Dent's complaint reopened. Haller rules that the irrigation infrastructure at that eastern point needs to be formally re-adjudicated. And Marsh and I spend 6 months fighting it in Laramie, while the legal fees eat through the operating account, and the uncertainty affects our credit with the suppliers. He said it flatly, without dramatics. Ranch doesn't fail from a single blow. It fails from 6 months of friction and cost, while the man causing the friction sits in his hotel in Kansas City and pays his lawyers and waits. She absorbed this. And the best case, Marsh convinces the court that natural drift along a 50-year-old survey line is not grounds for re-adjudication. And Haller, who already went out on a limb for Foss once and had Pearl Whitfield look at him the way she did. Besides, this is not the hill he wants to be standing on. He paused. That's a realistic best case, not a certain one. So the question is which way Haller goes. Haller and what the survey actually shows and what Marsh can do with it. He set the coffee down. There's also the question of what Foss does if the legal avenue fails again. It has other levers. He'll find them. Clara looked at her hands. Meh. She had been thinking about something for several days, and she had not decided whether to say it, had been turning it over and examining it from different angles, checking it for the ways it could go wrong. I want to write a letter, she said. He looked at her. To a woman in Kansas City. Her name is Dorothea Spence. She was a housekeeper at Foss's hotel for 9 years. She was there the whole time I was there. She saw how he treated the women in his employ. She saw what he tried to do and what happened when it didn't work. Clara kept her voice steady. She never said anything publicly. She had her reasons she needed the position. She had family depending on her income. She was afraid of what he'd do. But she told me, privately, before I left, that she knew the truth and that she was ashamed of not speaking. William was very still. You think she'd say something now? I think it's been 18 months, and she might have left his employ by now. I think a man who has followed me to Wyoming and is threatening the livelihood of an entire ranch is a different scale of thing than the original situation, and she might see it that way too. A pause. I also think she might say no, or not respond at all, and that's a real possibility I've accounted for. What would her letter do? It might not do anything legally. Marsh would know better than I do. But a signed account from a witness, someone with no stake in our situation, someone who was there, is different from my word against his. She looked at him directly. He's been operating for a long time, because the women he damages don't have anyone to corroborate them. They're always alone when it happens, and he makes sure they stay alone afterward. William looked at her for a long moment. Write the letter, he said. She wrote it that night, after the children were in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up as high as it would go. She wrote 3 drafts, the first 2 formal, the second 2 plaintive, the third landing somewhere in the plainness that she hoped would reach Dorothea without pressuring her, telling her what Foss was doing and what it was costing, asking if she would be willing to put in writing what she had told Clara the night Clara left. She wrote her name at the bottom clearly. She put the Carter Ranch address for a reply. She gave it to William in the morning, and he read it without comment and handed it back. It's good, he said. Send it. She sent it through Frank Alderman at the telegraph office, who took it from her with a professional nod and asked no questions, for which she was grateful. And she came back to the ranch and made lunch and helped Lily with her reading lesson and kept the routine of the household moving the way it always moved. Because the routine was what held things together when the larger situation was out of her control, and she had always understood that keeping small things right was not a small thing. Survey team arrived on the 19th, 3 men with equipment and a county observer. Marcus met them at the eastern boundary at 7 in the morning and stayed with them through the entire 8-hour process without leaving their sight. He told Clara about it that evening in his laconic, precise way they had measured methodically. They had noted the deviation at the 2 points he'd already identified. They had photographed the fence line and the irrigation channel. They had been professional and offered no interpretation, which was their job. County Observer had documented everything and said the report would go to the land office within a week. William heard this from Marcus and went out to the barn and did not come back to the house for 2 hours. Clara left him alone. She knew when to leave things alone. What she did not leave alone was Ethan, who had been listening from the top of the stairs when Marcus reported, and who came to find her in the kitchen afterward with the specific contained panic of a child who has understood something he wasn't ready to understand. He stood in the kitchen doorway, the same doorway he'd stood in the first day, the same posture, though he was different now, and so was she, and so was the house they were both standing in. "Is my dad going to lose the ranch?" he asked. Clara turned from the stove and looked at him and made a decision in about 2 seconds about what kind of answer he needed. Not the soft one that would fail him later, not the brutal one that would knock him down. The honest one that gave him something to stand on. "I don't know," she said. "It's possible. I don't think it's likely, but I don't know. What I do know is that your father is doing everything right. He has a lawyer. He has the proper documents. He has people in this town who are on his side. He has Marcus, who is probably the most competent person I've ever met when it comes to knowing this land." Then absorbed this. "Who's trying to take it?" "A man named Foss. Came here a few months ago. You might have heard the name." She kept her voice matter of fact. "No more drama than the situation already had. The man my dad sent away." "Yes." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He had his father's jaw. She'd noticed it before the muscle-working quality when he was thinking hard. "Why does he want it?" "Because it's worth something. Good land, good water rights. And because your father said no to him, which is something men like Foss don't handle well." She paused. "Saying no to the wrong people sometimes has consequences. It doesn't mean the no was wrong." He thought about this. "Is that what happened to you? In Kansas City?" It surprised her not that he'd connected it, which was sharp and observant of him, but that he asked directly. She looked at this 9-year-old boy who was practicing very hard at being tougher than he felt, and decided he deserved the same honesty she'd given about the ranch. "Yes," she said. "I said no to Gerald Foss, and he made things hard for me because of it. Why he's here, he followed the problem." "You," Ethan said. "Me." She held his look. "Which I know is complicated for you. I'm sorry for that." He was quiet again. Outside, the winter wind moved against the house in its constant, restless way. "Are you going to leave?" he asked. She thought about all the times she'd left. All the times the answer to that question had been yes, even when she hadn't known it yet herself. "No," she said. "I'm not leaving." He nodded. Twice the way his father nodded when something had been settled. Then he came in and sat at the end of the kitchen table and picked up the book Lily had left there and started reading it, which was his particular way of staying somewhere without making a declaration about it. She turned back to the stove and let him be there and did not say anything about it, and the kitchen held them both in its ordinary, steady way, warm and lit and smelling of the soup she had on for dinner. December moved into the coldest part of itself. Days shortened to almost nothing, and the nights came hard, and the mountains disappeared behind clouds that dropped snow in slow, relentless accumulations. The ranch turned inward, the way it did in winter. The work tightening to the essential, the distances between buildings mattering more. Clara had not heard from Dorothea Spence. She had not expected to hear quickly a letter to Kansas City, and back took time in good conditions, and December was not good conditions. She told herself this when she checked with Frank Alderman and found nothing. She told herself it was too early. She told herself Dorothea might not still be at the same address. She kept herself useful, which was the only reliable strategy she had ever had. Theodore Marsh arrived at the ranch on December 28th. She had not known he was coming. William had wired him about the survey results and had, apparently, at some point that he hadn't mentioned to her, asked him to come in person. Marsh was a small, precise man, somewhere past 60, with a kind of face that gave away very little deliberately and a great deal accidentally if you knew how to read it. He arrived on the afternoon stage, took the wagon Marcus sent for him, and was at the ranch by 4 o'clock. Clara fed him dinner. She sat at the kitchen table while he and William worked at the front room desk because William had not told her to leave and she had not offered to, and the door between rooms was open enough that she could hear. Marsh laid it out the way lawyers laid things out systematically, without sentiment, with the careful precision of a man who had learned that false comfort was more expensive than accurate bad news. A survey report had been filed. The deviation at the eastern point, the 4 yards, had been documented as an actual discrepancy between the 1,871 filing and the current physical markers. Holt Property Associates, which Marsh's contacts in Denver had now confirmed, was controlled by a Gerald Foss operating through 2 intermediate holding companies. It had formally petitioned the county to reopen the Dent complaint on the basis of the survey findings. Collar had accepted the petition. William said nothing for a moment. Then when is the hearing? 3rd week of January, Marsh said. Your assessment. Honest assessment? Marsh set his pen down. Deviation is small, and the legal argument for natural drift over 50 years is sound. In front of a judge with no stake in the outcome, I would expect to win this. In front of Haller, who has now accepted 2 Foss-connected petitions and will face pressure from that camp, I give us perhaps 60-40 odds. Not bad odds, but not comfortable ones. A pause. There is one thing that would change them. What thing? Character evidence. Foss himself has no formal record, no court judgments against him, no official complaints. But if there is testimony, even informal documentation, that establishes a pattern of this kind of conduct following former employees, orchestrating legal harassment to force economic pressure, it changes the picture. Not the legal question of the survey deviation, but the context in which a judge hears the case. He picked up his pen again. Is there anything like that available? Clara came through the door from the kitchen. Both men looked at her. She stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides and said, I wrote to a woman in Kansas City who was a witness to how he operates. I haven't heard back yet, but I can also give you my own account in writing what happened in Kansas City. Timeline, the way he followed me here, progression of what he's done since arriving in Willow Creek. Won't be corroborated, but it will be detailed and signed. Marsh looked at her with the assessing, non-committal expression of a lawyer considering a piece of evidence. You're Miss Whitmore. I am. William has told me the situation. He looked at her steadily. Signed account from you has value. It has more value if the Kansas City witness responds. Combined, they establish a pattern that a judge can consider when evaluating the intent behind the petition. He paused. Risk is that Foss will use your account to make the case that this is personal on your part, that you have a grievance against him and are influencing Mr. Carter accordingly. He'll make that case regardless, Clara said. He's been making it since he arrived here. Marsh looked at William. William looked at Clara. Something passed between them that the lawyer noted and filed away without commenting on. Write the account, Marsh said to Clara, as detailed as you can make it. Dates, locations, specific incidents, specific words where you remember them. Don't editorialize just facts in order. All right, she said. She went back to the kitchen and got her recipe notebook, the only writing paper she consistently had near her, and turned to the clean pages at the back and began. It took her 3 hours. She sat at the kitchen table while the fire burned down and the house quieted around her, and she wrote it all out. 11 months at the Foss Hotel in Kansas City, the specific night he had come to her room, and what he had said and what she had said back. Subsequent weeks of what he called reassignment that moved her to the worst kitchen shifts and lowest status work. The conversation where he had told her that no one in Kansas City would employ her the night she left. She wrote it in her plain handwriting, deliberately, without the anger she felt underneath every sentence. When she was done, she read it once and then went to find Marsh. He was still at the front room desk. William had gone somewhere. She could hear him upstairs, probably checking on the children. She handed Marsh the notebook pages. He read them without expression. When he was done, he looked up. This is good, he said. Specific and credible. He straightened the pages. I'll need it transcribed to proper paper before the hearing. Can you copy it clean? Yes. And the Kansas City witness. I'll wire again tomorrow, she said. Ask Frank Alderman if anything came while I wasn't checking. Marsh looked at her in the same measuring way he'd looked at William's documents. Understand, he said, that what you've written here, if it's submitted, becomes part of a public legal record. I know, she said. That means Foss will have access to it. He will respond to it. He will almost certainly commission a counter-account, find people willing to say things that contradict what you've written. I know that too, she said. I've been living with his counter-account for 18 months. The difference is that now mine will be written down somewhere official. Marsh made a small sound that might have been respect, put the pages into his case and closed it. She wired Frank Alderman the next morning. He wired back the same afternoon. There was a letter waiting at the telegraph office. From Kansas City. She went to town herself. The letter was in Dorothea Spence's handwriting. She recognized it from the small notes Dorothea had sometimes left in the hotel kitchen. The envelope had been through what looked like some rough handling in transit, one corner creased and resealed. Open. She stood in the telegraph office and held it for a moment before she opened it, because she understood that what was inside was going to determine something significant. Frank Alderman was doing something at the far end of his counter, very carefully not watching her. She opened the letter. Dorothea had left Foss's employ 8 months ago. She had found a position as housekeeper at a private home, and was, she wrote, considerably happier. She had read Clara's letter 4 times, she said, and she had shown it to her sister, who had told her to do what was right, regardless of the cost. She had been trying to determine what was right for 3 weeks. What she had decided was this: she would write a statement. She would have it witnessed by a notary in Kansas City. She would describe what she had seen during Clara's time at the hotel, not speculation, not interpretation, but what she had seen with her own eyes and heard with her own ears. She enclosed the statement with the letter. Clara read the statement, pages in Dorothea's careful, the upright handwriting, witnessed and notarized, dated December 21st. Described 4 specific incidents involving Foss and women in his employ. Clara's situation was described in 2 of them, one that Dorothea had witnessed partially, one that she had heard through a door that had not been as closed as Foss believed. Language was plain and specific and entirely corroborated what Clara had written. Stood in the telegraph office and read it twice, and then folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. Good news? Frank Alderman said at the far end of the counter. Yes, Clara said. I think so. She took it to Marsh at the hotel where he was staying. He read it carefully, read it again, and set it on the table in front of him. Looked at it for a long moment. This changes things, he said. Does it help? Miss Whitmore. He looked up at her with the first expression that wasn't professionally neutral she'd seen from him. A witnessed, notarized account from an independent witness with no stake in the Wyoming proceedings, describing a pattern of conduct over time, yes. This helps considerably. He picked it up again. I'll need to understand the legal admissibility in a Wyoming proceeding. That may take some work. But the existence of this, he stopped. Won't know it exists until I introduce it. That element of surprise has value. She thought about Gerald Foss in that hotel in Kansas City, smoothly certain that the women he had damaged would stay damaged. They would stay scattered and separate and unable to reach each other across the distances he had put between them. That being alone was a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. No, he had been wrong about that. He had been wrong about her specifically for 18 months. And she had finally, in the small telegraph office town in Wyoming, proven it. She walked back to the ranch in the cold afternoon and found the house exactly as she'd left it. Lily's coat on the hook, the smell of the fire she'd banked before she left still warming the front room, William's boots at the door. Ethan was doing his lessons at the kitchen table, frowning at arithmetic the way he always frowned at arithmetic. He looked up when she came in. You look like something happened, he said. Something did, she said. Something good. He looked at her for a moment with his father's considering expression, then turned back to his arithmetic. Good, he said like it was settled. She hung up her coat and went to find William. He was in the barn again, and she stood in the doorway the way she had, on the day she'd said, "We have a problem," and he turned and read her face the same way he'd read it then. Dorothea Spence wrote back, Clara said. Something moved across his face, came toward her, and she wrote a statement. Notarized, witnessed, Marsh says it changes things. She paused. Doesn't guarantee anything. Marsh was clear about that. Changes things. He stood close enough that she could see the cold he'd been carrying, the redness at his ears, the frost on his collar. Upda. He looked at her with an expression that was complicated in the same way his face got complicated when he was working through something, except that this time she thought she could read it better than before. You've been carrying this for 18 months, he said. Alone. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. You're not carrying it alone anymore, he said. I want to make sure you know that. She looked at him. She had been looked at in this doorway, before assessed, dismissed,
Evaluated.
found wanting. This was none of those things. This was the look of a person who had decided something and was saying it plainly, because plainness was the only language either of them fully trusted. I know, she said. The barn was cold and the horses moved behind him, and the afternoon was already failing out past the open doors, the light going thin and gray in the way of December in Wyoming. None of it was comfortable. None of it was resolved. January, and the hearing and Foss and whatever move came, after Foss was still in front of them, the full shape of it still unclear. She was in a doorway she had earned the right to stand in, and there was a man looking at her who had not once tried to send her away. That was not everything, but it was more than she had started with. She turned toward the house. "Dinner in an hour," she said. "I'll be in," he said. She walked back across the yard, and the cold settled around her, and behind her she heard the barn door close against the wind. The third week of January came in hard. Snow fell for 2 days before the hearing, the kind that came sideways off the mountains and packed itself into every seam and gap in the ranch buildings. And the morning of the hearing, Clara was up at 4 because she could not sleep and because the kitchen was the only place she knew how to be useful when her hands needed something to do. She made bread. She made enough for 3 days because it gave her more time to stand at the table and work. And working was the only thing that kept the waiting from becoming unbearable. The dough went under her hands in the dark kitchen, and she listened to the house breathe around her, the specific creak of Ethan's bed frame when he turned over, the way the front window rattled in the northeast wind, distant sound of Marcus moving in the bunkhouse across the yard. William came down at 5:30. He was already dressed in the good dark jacket he wore for town, which she had brushed and hung by the kitchen door the night before without being asked. Stopped when he saw the bread. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Not much," she said. He poured his own coffee and stood by the window and looked out at the dark yard. "Marsh will be at the courthouse at 8. We ride at 7. "I know." He turned. "You don't have to come." She looked at him steadily. "I know that too." He held her look for a moment and then turned back to the window, which was his way of accepting something without making a ceremony of it. They drank their coffee in the dark kitchen, while the bread rose and the ranch outside began its slow morning assembly, the horses moving in the barn, the first light coming gray and cold over the eastern ridge. "Whatever happens today," he said, still looking out the window. She waited. "Whatever happens," he said again and stopped. He was not a man who said things before he had them assembled properly, and she had learned to give him the time he needed. "I want you to know that the ranch, what you've built here in this house, that doesn't depend on what Haller decides. I want that to be clear before we go." She set her coffee cup down. She understood what it cost him to say it, and she understood why he'd said it today. Before the hearing, where it could not be read as a response to outcome. He was saying it now precisely, so she would know it was not contingent. "Thank you," she said. The same 2 words she'd said the first time he told her something that mattered. In the barn, months ago. Ray still said everything she had. Courthouse in Willow Creek was a stone building on the east end of Main Street that also housed the land office and the sheriff's office. All 3 functions crammed under one roof with the practical economy of a small town that built for necessity rather than ceremony. The hearing room was on the 2nd floor, 20 wooden chairs arranged before a raised bench, a table on either side for the opposing parties, a clerk's desk to the left. Clara came in with William and Marcus and found Theodore Marsh already at the plaintiff's table, with his leather case open and his papers arranged. He looked up when they entered and gave a small, precise nod that conveyed readiness without reassurance. Room filled in the next 20 minutes. She had not expected so many people. Judge Haller had made the hearing officially public record, which meant anyone could attend, and it appeared that a significant portion of Willow Creek had decided to exercise that right. Pearl Whitfield was in the 3rd row, in her good coat and her most formidable hat, flanked by Doc Greer on one side and Frank Alderman on the other. Reeves' family was there, all 4 of them, which she recognized as a statement. She saw other faces she knew from town, from the general store, from months of supply runs and brief, weighted interactions. Margaret Elroy was also there. Clara saw her, and Margaret saw her, and neither of them looked away first, which was a kind of progress, or at least a kind of honesty. Gerald Foss entered from the opposite door with his own lawyer, a younger man from Laramie named Cutter, that Marsh had mentioned in passing, describing him as capable and aggressive and accustomed to winning on technical grounds. Foss wore the dark wool city coat. He moved through the room with the settled confidence of a man who had done this kind of thing before and expected to do it again. Glanced at Clara once, briefly. His expression was precisely calibrated, not triumphant, not nervous. Patient, the expression of a man who could afford to wait. She kept her face still and looked at the front of the room. Caller came in at 8 on the hour. He was a narrow man with a carefully maintained mustache and the expression of someone aware of being watched. He settled at the bench and arranged his papers and looked at the room over his reading glasses with the specific discomfort of a man who had expected a smaller audience. Proceeding opened with Cutter presenting Foss's case, which he did with the smooth efficiency of a man who had rehearsed it thoroughly. Survey findings. The documented deviation. The 1,871 filings insufficiency to account for the current physical discrepancy. Petition by Holt Property Associates. And here he used the corporate name without elaborating on its ownership, which was deliberate for formal re-adjudication of the eastern boundary and the irrigation infrastructure associated with it. It was a clean technical argument. Clara listened to it and understood why Marsh had said 60-40. On pure technical grounds, without context, without the shape of what was actually happening, it had the surface appearance of a legitimate property dispute. Marsh stood when it was his turn. He was not a dramatic lawyer. That was the first thing Clara had noticed when William described him, and the first thing she observed now. He did not pace or gesture or raise his voice. He laid things out the way he laid papers on a desk, in order, in sequence, each piece placed where it could be seen clearly. He addressed the survey deviation first. Produced from Marcus and from a surveyor he had himself commissioned. Testimony that the 4-yard discrepancy at the eastern point was consistent with fence line reconstruction following the winter of 1887, which had been, as documented in county weather records, one of the most destructive winters in the territory's history. He had affidavits from 2 neighboring property owners confirming that fence reconstruction in the area following that winter had been widespread and had resulted in similar small variations in other properties, none of which had been subjected to legal challenge. 1,871 filing, D, he argued, remained the controlling legal document. Natural variation resulting from documented catastrophic conditions did not constitute an unauthorized boundary alteration. Petition had no legal foundation. Haller listened. His expression was the careful, neutral expression of a man deliberating, or performing deliberation. Marsh said, "Your Honor, the court should also be informed of the broader context in which this petition was filed." Cutter was on his feet immediately. Objection. The survey findings are the relevant matter before this court. Petitioner's motivations are not. The court will hear Mr. Marsh, Haller said. He said it carefully, which Clara took as meaningful. Marsh produced the documents one at a time. First, a certified record from the Denver Incorporation Office confirming that Holt Property Associates was controlled by Gerald Foss, the same Gerald Foss who had previously appeared at the Carter Ranch in person and been asked to leave. Second, a timeline, documented through the county's own records, of the events following Foss's visit to the ranch, the delayed feed orders, departure of a ranch hand subsequently seen in Foss's company, the original Dent complaint, and now this petition, all occurring in sequence following William Carter's refusal to accommodate Foss's agenda regarding a member of his household. Third, and here, Marsh paused for a moment. With the timing of a man who understood that placement mattered, he submitted Clara's signed account, transcribed clean onto proper paper in her clear handwriting, describing the events in Kansas City, the pattern of Foss's conduct toward employees who refused him, and the subsequent actions he had taken against her livelihood across 3 states. Fourth, Dorothea Spence's notarized statement. He read the relevant portions aloud. Not all 6 pages, just the specific passages that described what Dorothea had witnessed. Her plain, upright sentences in his measured voice read into the official record of a Wyoming courtroom. Room was very quiet. Clara looked at the table in front of her. She could feel the quality of the quiet, not empty, not the polite silence of people waiting for the next thing, but the weighted silence of people who had just heard something that was reorganizing the picture they'd been working with. She made herself look up, not at Haller, at Foss. He was looking at the papers in Marsh's hands with an expression she had never seen on him before. Pleasantness was gone, not cracked this time, not flickering, but entirely absent. What was underneath it was a man recalculating, running the mathematics of a situation that had not gone where he intended, and finding the numbers coming out in a direction he could not adjust for in the next 30 seconds. She had thought she would feel more. Triumph, maybe, or relief, or the satisfaction of watching his composure fail in a public room. What she actually felt was quieter than any of those things. Something more like completion, the sense of a long loop finally closing. Cutter objected vigorously to the admission of the Spence statement as not directly relevant to the property question before the court. Marsh argued that evidence of systematic harassment established through documented pattern was relevant to the court's evaluation of the petitioner's intent and to its exercise of equitable discretion. Haller deliberated with his papers for a long moment. He admitted the statement. Cutter's objection on that point was overruled. Something in the room shifted again, not dramatically, not with the loud pivot of stories that wrap themselves up neatly, but with the small, decisive tilt of a scale that has finally found its balance point. Haller ruled at 11 o'clock. He found that the documented deviation in the fence line was consistent with natural variation following the 1887 winter, and did not constitute grounds for re-adjudication of the boundary established in the 1871 filing. He dismissed the petition. He also noted, in language that was measured and careful and clearly written with awareness of its permanence in the official record, that the court had reviewed evidence suggesting the petition was brought in the context of a sustained campaign of legal and economic pressure against the Carter Ranch, and that should any further petitions regarding Carter property rights be brought before this court, that context would be part of the record considered. Was not, Clara knew, a verdict against Foss himself. He had not been charged with anything. He could not be. He had operated just inside the lines, as men like him always did, never quite crossing into what could be formally named and punished. What had happened today was not justice in the complete sense. It was something smaller and more honest than that, a public accounting, a paper trail, a documented pattern that he would have to carry into every subsequent room he entered in this territory. It was enough. Not everything enough. The room began to move. Chairs scraped. Voices resumed. Marsh came around the table and shook William's hand with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done his job and was already thinking about the next thing on his desk. William thanked him in the plain, direct way. He thanked people no excess, but nothing left out either. Clara stood and watched Gerald Foss leave. He walked out of the courtroom without speaking to anyone, without looking at her, without the smoothness of his usual exit performance. He was a man who had just had his tool taken from his hand in a public room. He was adjusting. Recalibrating, thinking about next moves. She knew that about him well enough to know he would not simply stop. The next move would have to be different. It would have to be somewhere else, against someone without Theodore Marsh and Dorothea Spence's notarized statement, and Pearl Whitfield sitting in the third row, in her most formidable hat. Went down the stairs and out into the January cold, and she did not watch the door close behind him. She turned and found William beside her. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and she had stopped being careful about true things around him some months back, "Yes, I'm all right." Pearl Whitfield came to the ranch 2 days later. She arrived mid-morning in a buggy driven by her grandson, a boy of about 14 who had Pearl's directness in miniature and who unhitched the horse and led it to the barn without being asked. But Pearl came to the front door and knocked. And Clara answered it. The old woman stood on the porch and looked at her with those bright, assessing eyes. "I came to tell you something," Pearl said. "Come in," Clara said. "I'll put coffee on." Pearl came in and sat at the kitchen table, not where Lily usually sat, but at the near end, closest to the door, like someone who was staying for a specific purpose and not indefinitely. She looked around the kitchen with the attention of a person who had been in many kitchens and knew what they were for. "I was in this kitchen when Eleanor Carter was alive," Pearl said. "She kept it the same way you do, the coffee pot at the back, breadboard near the window." Clara poured the coffee and set it down. She did not say anything about Eleanor. That was not her story to handle. "I want to tell you about what Willow Creek is saying," Pearl said, "because you should know, and because no one else is likely to tell you directly." She picked up the coffee. "Margaret Elroy is not saying the things she was saying in November. That doesn't mean she's apologized, because Margaret does not apologize. She's not saying them. I noticed," Clara said. "What you did the lawyer. The statement from Kansas City, standing up in that room, people saw it. People who were inclined to believe Foss's version have had to reconsider." Pearl set the cup down. Small towns run on stories. The story they had about you was the one Foss gave them. Now there's a different story, and the new one has official documents attached to it, which the old one never did. Does it matter? Clara said, not bitterly, genuinely asking. Pearl looked at her for a moment. Does it matter to you what they think? Clara thought about it honestly, the way Pearl seemed to expect. I stopped needing their approval a long time ago, she said. I'd be lying if I said the way people looked at me in November didn't cost something. It always costs something, even when you've learned not to show it. Yes, Pearl said. It does. That's the honest answer. She picked the coffee back up. What I'm telling you is that the cost is going down. Not to nothing, there will always be people in this town who decided about you before they knew you and won't revisit the decision. The landscape has changed. Clara nodded. She believed this, and she also understood that it was secondary to what she had actually been fighting for, which was not Willow Creek's approval, but the right to remain in a place she had chosen and built herself into. The approval was a byproduct. She could take it or leave it. One more thing, Pearl said. William Carter has not said a word to anyone in this town about his intentions. He is, as I have noted before, a man who keeps his own counsel to an occasionally maddening degree. She looked at Clara with the directness of a woman who had been around too long for indirection. But I have known him since he was born, and I have watched him watch you from across a room. She paused. I wanted you to know that what I've seen is not the way a man looks at an employee. Clara held Pearl's gaze. I'm not telling you what to do about it, Pearl said. It's your business. I'm telling you what I've seen because I think you've spent a long time in rooms where people's intentions were hidden from you, and someone with good intentions should be named clearly. Clara was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Pearl. Good coffee, Pearl said, finished it, and was ready to leave 5 minutes later. She thought about what Pearl had said for 3 days. Not obsessively, she had too much to do for obsession, but it moved in and out of her awareness the way things did when they were true, and you were trying to decide what to do with their truth. She had not let herself think directly about William in that way. She had noticed things, the way he said her first name when it slipped out, barn doorway conversations. Thee will deal with it. You belong here. And she had noticed them and then carefully filed them in a category she called not yet certain and gone back to the kitchen. She was a woman who had been wrong about people's intentions before. She was a woman who had confused professional dependence for something more human before in a kitchen in Kansas City. And the memory of that mistake had made her conservative with herself in ways that were sometimes right and sometimes just fearful. Pearl Whitfield had been watching people for 73 years, and she did not say things she was not sure of. Occasion came on a Saturday evening in late January, after the children were in bed. William had doing the tack work again. She could hear the characteristic sounds of it from the kitchen, the barn being the place he went when his head was full. She waited until she had finished the bread for the next day, and then she put on her coat and walked across the yard. He heard her coming and turned from the wall of tack. He didn't look surprised exactly. He looked like a man who had been expecting something and was not sure what shape it would take. She stood in the barn doorway, which was her place for the real conversations. Mashi, and she said, I want to ask you something directly, because I've found that direct is the only thing that doesn't cause problems between people. All right, he said. Pearl Whitfield came to see me. Raised an eyebrow. Of course she did. She told me what she's noticed. You watching me. Clara kept her voice level, not because she was not feeling things, but because level was the language they both understood best. I want to know if she's right. Because if she is, I'd rather know it plainly than in peripheral looks across a room. And if she isn't, I'd rather know that plainly too and stop wondering. William set down what he was holding. He came toward the doorway, stopped a few feet away. He had the considering expression, the one she'd been reading for 4 months, the one that meant he was working something through to its honest end before he said it. She's right, he said. The simplicity of it was almost startling. She had been ready for more negotiation, more careful qualification, more of the characteristic pulling back. He had just said it the way you said a fact. I'm not asking you for anything, he said before she could respond. I want to say that first. You have a position here that's yours regardless. This is not a condition of anything. I know that, she said. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. He looked at her steadily. Came here in October with a suitcase held together with rope and a notebook full of recipes and about 30 years of being underestimated, and you rebuilt something in this house that I'd stopped believing could be rebuilt. He paused. I'm not talking about the cooking. You know what I'm talking about. She did. I don't know what to do with it, he said, with the frankness she'd come to depend on. I haven't. It's been 3 years since Eleanor. I'm not good at this. I was not particularly good at it when I was younger and had more practice. A pause. Pearl was right about what she saw, and I'm done pretending otherwise. Clara stood in the barn doorway in the January cold and looked at this man who had stood at his front door and sent Gerald Foss away, who had sat with her in a lamplit room and spread his land documents and trusted her with the full, unvarnished picture, who had said we'll deal with it and meant it. It was not easy and not simple, and not without his own damage and grief, and the particular stiffness of a person who had learned that the world took things from you if you weren't careful. She had not come to Wyoming looking for this. She had come looking for a wage and a roof and a place where she could build something that was hers. She had not known that what she built could include a person. I'm not easy to know, she said. I've noticed, he said. I carry things a long time without saying them. I'm used to managing alone. I'm not practiced at trusting people. I've noticed that too, he said. You still, and I still, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the Wyoming night was cold and clear and enormous, the way it always was. The mountains invisible in the dark but present, the way things were present when you knew the shape of them well enough. All right then, she said. He looked at her. All right then, he said carefully. I'm not going to make it easy, she said. I'm not asking for easy. He said it with the faintest edge of something that might have been humor or might have been relief. I have a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old and 40 head of cattle and a water rights situation I just narrowly avoided losing. Easy is not a thing I have much experience with either. She almost smiled. It arrived on her face before she could decide about it, and she let it stay. Go inside, he said. It's too cold to stand in a doorway. You're in a barn. I've been in this barn for an hour. I'm adjusted. She went inside. February came, and March came, and the ranch moved through winter toward the first distant suggestion of spring. And the life of the household continued in the way lives continued imperfectly, with interruptions, with the daily friction of real people in close proximity who cared about each other and therefore sometimes got on each other's nerves. Ethan went through a period in February of being extremely difficult about everything, the way 9-year-olds did periodically, testing the limits of whatever structure he was living in. And there were 3 evenings in a row where dinner was tense, and Clara bit her tongue, and William was too tired to be patient, and the whole household went to bed feeling poorly about itself. On the 4th day, Ethan came to the kitchen in the morning and said, without looking at her, I was being bad. She said, I know. I was being short-tempered, too. He looked up, surprised that she'd admitted it. We're even, she said, and handed him his breakfast. That was not a perfect resolution. It was a real one. Lily and the orange cake happened in March. Clara had been collecting recipes since November, testing versions quietly on baking days, not mentioning it to Lily, not wanting to make it a thing if it turned out wrong. She made 4 different versions before she found the one that came closest to butter cake with orange zest worked into the batter, a simple thin frosting that let the flavor come through. She brought it to the dinner table on a Thursday without ceremony. Lily tasted it. She was quiet for a long moment that Clara did not try to fill. It's not exactly the same, Lily said. No, Clara said. Probably isn't. Lily looked at the slice in front of her. It's close, though. I'm glad. Lily ate the whole piece and then looked at the cake and said, Could I learn how to make it? Yes, Clara said, whenever you want. That was also not a perfect moment. It was quieter and more complicated than that, because the orange cake was also grief. And learning to make it was Lily's way of holding on to something she was afraid of losing. And neither of them said any of that out loud. Clara carried it the same way. She carried the things Lily left with her carefully, without making them heavier than they were. William asked her to marry him on a Sunday in April, which was not a dramatic occasion by any of the usual measures. They were sitting on the front porch in the early evening, the first evening warm enough to be outside without coats, watching the light go long and golden across the yard. Children were somewhere in the barn with Marcus, who had agreed, with considerable dignity, to explain the correct way to brush down a horse for the 14th time. He said it the way he said the things that mattered plainly, without staging or decoration. He said he understood. It was a large thing to ask, and he wasn't asking her to answer immediately, and then he was quiet and let her have the silence. She had known it was coming. She had known it the way you knew things that had been building for a long time, felt rather than calculated. Gah! She had thought about it and turned it over, and looked at it from the angles that frightened her and the angles that didn't. She thought about 32 years of being underestimated. She thought about 14 towns in the suitcase with the rope clasp, and the way she had walked into each new kitchen telling herself to want less, take less, need less. She thought about what it had cost her to confuse smallness with safety. And she thought about Pearl Whitfield's voice, saying someone with good intentions should be named clearly, and Ethan in the kitchen doorway, and Lily's face over the orange cake in the barn doorway in January, and the word "we" coming from someone else's mouth and landing in her chest like something that had been looking for that exact spot for a very long time. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before, not the complex consideration, not the careful control. Something simpler and more exposed. "Yes," she said again, steadier. "I mean it." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there wasn't anything that needed saying just then. The light went down and the yard went purple and dark, and from somewhere in the barn, they could hear Lily asking Marcus a question about horses, and Marcus answering with the patience he brought to everything. And Ethan's voice saying something that made Lily laugh, a real laugh. Kind that started in the stomach. Kind Clara had been listening for since October and had heard more of lately. Not enough yet to take for granted, but more. Wedding happened in May, small and plain, and unannounced to the town until it was done. Pearl Whitfield was there, Doc Greer, Frank Alderman, Marcus, and the children. Cake Lily had helped make it, standing on a stool at the kitchen table with flour on her dress, taking the work seriously, in the way she took all work seriously. Margaret Elroy heard about it on Monday and said something to the woman behind the general store counter that Clara did not hear and did not try to hear. What she heard instead, coming into the store 2 days later, was Mrs. Hatch, the same Mrs. Hatch who had been distant and deliberate and brief all through November, saying good morning and asking, without evident difficulty, how she was settling in. Question was plain and imperfect and entirely real, and Clara answered it the same way. Not every person in Willow Creek changed their mind. Some didn't, and some who did change their minds changed them slowly and with visible effort and were never going to be warm about it. That was how people were, and she had stopped expecting otherwise a long time ago. She had stopped doing was needing the consensus. She had built something real, and she knew it was real because she had put it together with her own hands, piece by careful piece, and she knew the weight of every part. She thought sometimes about what it meant, this life she had not known she was building when she stepped off the train in October with a suitcase held together by rope. She had come looking for a wage and found something. She didn't have a ready word for not rescue, which implied she couldn't have managed otherwise, and she could have. Not luck, which implied it came from outside her. Something closer to what happened when you stopped running long enough to actually stand in a place, and the place turned out to be worth standing in. It was a thing she had learned, across all those years of kitchens and new towns, and starting over, that she had not been able to say clearly until now. It was not a comfortable thing to know, and it was not the thing that stories usually ended with. And it was this, that the world would judge you before it knew you, every time, without exception, and that no amount of competence or patience or good behavior would fully prevent that. Women at the general store would look. Margaret Elroy would say things behind her hand. Gerald Foss would find levers and use them. That was not going to stop. What you did with the judgment that was yours. Whether you accepted it as a verdict or recognized it as a first draft. Whether you ran from it or stood inside it long enough to let a different story start to form. Whether you kept moving through the 14 towns or whether, one October morning, you got off a train and looked at a cold Wyoming town and decided that this was the place you were going to stay. She had not known she was deciding that. She thought she was just looking for a job. The body knew things the mind hadn't caught up with yet, and she had stayed. In June, she planted the kitchen garden with Lily, both of them kneeling in the dirt on a warm afternoon while William and Ethan worked the fence line in the distance, and the mountains did their permanent patient thing on the horizon. Lily asked, while pressing seeds into the row Clara had prepared, whether Clara had always known what she wanted. No, Clara said. I'm not sure I knew until I had it. Lily pressed another seed. Thought about this. Is that okay? Not knowing before? I think so, Clara said. I think sometimes knowing before is not the thing. Sometimes you just have to walk into enough rooms until you find the one you don't want to leave. Lily looked at the seed in her hand. I don't want to leave this one, she said. Neither do I, Clara said. They kept planting. Afternoons settled around them. Warm and ordinary and entirely itself, on the ranch held them the way it held everything steadily, without ceremony. The quiet permanence of a thing that had been built to last. That was enough. That was she had finally learned. Exactly enough.